Testing and all that. Listen, we'll get the meeting going. Thank you to everyone for coming on this windy night. A very important event, I think. And if you don't think, well, we'll see by the end of the meeting. We're having two panels here tonight. Each speaker, 4 speakers in each panel. Each speaker will have a maximum, I'll say a maximum of 15 minutes, which will mean the first panel will speak for an hour. Then we put it over to you for questions rather than statements, hopefully. And then we will move on to the next panel, which will be more from a European perspective. The first 4 on the first 4 panel will be all TDs. And then we'll go into another half an hour of question, and then we'll go off and do what we're doing. But the topic is, are we heading towards an EU army? And since I started organising this event, and since I started getting involved in this whole area, one of the main cries I hear from people is on the question of are we heading for a European army, is that it is never going to happen, and that it's just scaremongering. And if ever there was a time to have a discussion on this topic, it's now. The cover for those who say that it's scaremongering to suggest that the EU have plans for a European army was well and truly blown up this week, with a statement by Emmanuel Macron where he said unambiguously that he wanted not just a European army, but a true European army. But no more than one other similarly powerful politicians have said this, the sceptics will continue to bury their head in the sands. German MEP Manfred Weber, who is head of the largest group in the European Parliament, has also expressed his support for a European army. When I point this out to sceptics that there'll ever be a European army, I was told that the man was insignificant. Now, what I've written down here is, well, he isn't insignificant. Yet again, I wish he was. And I'd written down here that he is the favourite to become the Spitzen candidate for the European People's Party at the next European elections, which means that, by the way, today he was chosen, and it means that after the European elections, if the EPP are the biggest party in the European Parliament, he will become the next Commission President. So, he wants a European army. No big deal, apparently, I'm told. Now, we already have a Commission President who strongly believes in a European army. Jean-Claude Juncker has clearly stated that a common European army would convey a clear message to Russia that we are serious about defending our European values. Mr. Juncker is passionate about this whole area, passionate to the point that when announcing PESCO, he described it as the awakening of a sleeping beauty. To me, it was like listening to Dr. Frankenstein manically celebrating when his monster rose from the operating table. Mr. Juncker speaks of European values, as does his sidekick and supreme commander of the EU military project, Commissioner Federica Mogherini. What she said was that we would be using weapons in the European way. No need to worry. Cuddly bullets and the like. What does she mean, though? What does Mr. Juncker mean when he talks about European values? Values from which era are we talking about? Is it the present-day set of values that he wants us to protect? The present-day set of values that sees a plethora of European Union countries sell arms to Saudi Arabia in order that they can indiscriminately murder men, women and children? Is it the present-day European way which ignores the current genocide in Palestine? Is it the European way that ignores police brutality against independent supporters in Catalonia? Is it the European way which sees the ruling Hungarian government describe all Muslims as invaders? A government, by the way, whose MEPs sit in the same group as Fine Gael and Manfred Weber, who I mentioned earlier, as well as all the other Christian Democrats. That is the current European way. Is this what he wants us to protect? Or maybe he was talking about European values from the past, the European way of colonisation, the European values which wiped out indigenous people all over the world. Is it the European values of the British Empire? Need I go on? Is it the European values of 1940s Germany? Is it the values of King Leopold? Which values are we talking about when we're meant to go out and sacrifice our neutrality to go out and defend these values? What values are we talking about? Or maybe they're talking about the way that is currently the way, or the way that's on the way. There is an illusion somehow that this is all good, and it's all about everything in Europe is good, and we'll just be protecting the good. Then there's the European way that's on the way. In the upcoming European elections, the already successful far-right parties in Hungary, Austria, Italy and Poland, among many others, will fill the chambers of the European Parliament with far-right MEPs. Along with that, we would see the formation of a new Commission, which in contrast to 2014, and this is saying something, will be picked from an increasingly extreme right governments across the European Union. Are these the European values that we will really want to protect? Many people in Ireland are living with the illusion that somehow the EU is all about being nice, and that increasing military integration is somehow all the nice people banding together to save themselves from the bad people like Vladimir Putin. However, the way the European Union is heading politically, even those deluded enough to think that people like Emmanuel Macron are the good guys surely cannot say the same about the latest crop of European leaders. Do those in Ireland that currently support increased military alignment with the EU think that it is a good idea to club together with countries which are ran by fascists and ran by people who openly discriminate against those on the basis of their religion and ethnicity? Even those not traditionally seen as from the far-right spectrum are now dog-whistling messages about our supposed Christian heritage. And I'll mention his name yet again, because we don't hear enough of it. I wish we didn't have to hear it, but he's there. But Manfred Weber, yet again, he has used this language in order to stay in favour with these people. When he talks about defending Christian values, this is apparently what we're going to go out and defend. And defend ourselves against the enemy that we should all be terrified by. This is not something that has come about overnight. It has gradually developed. It's gone back a long time. I'll go back as far as 2004, as far as 1991. As far back as 1991, the European Council in Maastricht laid the foundations for a military union with the creation of a common foreign and security policy and the beginnings of a common defence policy as a second pillar of the Treaty of Maastricht. In July 2004, we witnessed the creation of the European Defence Agency. In 2009, with the coming into being of the ESDP as a common security and defence policy, this provided for the creation of the European External Action Force. But in the last couple of years, and in particular in the last year, this has been ramped up rapidly. We have seen the creation of PESCO, the permanent structured cooperation of 25 armies around the European Union. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. People say this is not an army. But I would say it's a bit like saying, I'm not married to my wife. I'm in a permanent structured cooperation agreement with her. Now, if I said that to her, she'd get suspicious. She'd be going, are you not quite happy with being married? Well, I am. I'm very, very happy with it. But we need to use the right language. You don't pretend you're doing something that... You don't pretend you're not doing something that you are doing. And to describe PESCO as anything other than, as far as I'm concerned, a European army is denying reality. Listen, I leave you there. We're now going to go into 4 speakers, 4 different TDs who I believe have made a massive contribution to this, way bigger contribution than I have over the years, and have a good knowledge on it. And hopefully we learn something about Irish neutrality and the threat that it's under from these people tonight, and hopefully I can take something away from it, and hopefully you can take something away from it. So the first person to speak is Thomas Pringle TD from Donegal. Welcome, Thomas.
Thanks very much, Ming, and thanks very much for the invitation here tonight. And it's a hard act to follow, and so I'll have to I will say my bit. I'm going to give an introduction. I think we're doing the first part. The 4 of us are giving our views on where we see Ireland is at the moment, and so I'll talk about that. So Before I get started on the key areas of PESCO and Federal Irish neutrality, I'd like to start with a fundamental point that militarisation, EU defence integration and the overall global militarisation agenda is being pushed and shaped by private sector interests. And I think that's very important. And recently, leaders in the EU arms industry partook in a conference of their own, the Munich Security Conference, which took place in Munich in February. Here, EU defence company giants sought to integrate their defence programmes so Europe can compete with US and Russian defence companies. The German Defence Minister von der Leyen repeatedly indicated ahead of the conference that she wanted companies to form consortia or to merge so that they could compete with US companies in bids for upcoming contracts. German Franco military interests seek to develop their defence industries further so that they can control EU defence policy while globally competing with US and French direct defence companies. Global security will in turn secure Franco-German influence at home in Europe. And the process leading to PESCO is in no way a democratic one. We see how that works. The policy group was established by the EU Commission to develop PESCO, known as a group of personalities, and which mainly included EU arms industrialists intent on finding ways for EU governments to navigate around national sovereignty and neutrality, clauses so that greater EU military integration could be fostered. NGOs, humanitarian organisations, civil society, the academic world, or even the European Parliament were absent from the process and deliberately kept absent from it. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have essentially signed Ireland up to become a pawn in a very lucrative chess game, and we will be paying for it both financially and politically for the privilege. One of the striking things about PESCO is how it caught everyone off guard. Not only was it rushed through the Parliament, but it was also went under the Irish media's radar and was passed without much debate by parliaments across the EU. It made me think how this could have happened, and I know, yes, it could have happened with the Irish media not bothering to question it, and that would be the easy thing, and I'd say it probably has a lot to do with it, because the Irish media will play along with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and won't question and won't ask the hard questions because they don't want them to have to answer any questions, and they don't want to give any other voice of vision in it as well. But also, I think as well, the language that was used was down to linguistics, and the language of war usually functions to mask the reality of violence it intends to inflict. You will hear government discourse in defence of the PESCO speak in terms of euphemisms and grand statements to legitimise itself and dismantle efforts made by critics of war. It's important to acknowledge the discourse around PESCO and statements made in defence of EU militarisation. This linguistic game played by EU militarists will abuse our own terms like neutrality and peacekeeping. Words bandied around by the government in defence of PESCO, despite the fact that peacekeeping isn't mentioned once in the PESCO legislation. Simon Coveney stated in the Dáil that PESCO would help UN mandate missions engaged in peacekeeping, conflict prevention or strengthening of international security. Again, this war discourse attempting to legitimise itself while dismantling opposition voices. I believe this is how we were able to keep PESCO under the media's radar, but it's also indicative of the power of private sector interests to steer discourse in their favour and thereby circumnavigate democratic oversight. The government has stated time and time again that there is no commitment to increasing Ireland's defence expenditure to 2% of the GDP, and that the increase in real terms relates to meeting the agreed objectives of PESCO and not to Ireland's overall defence policy. Yet, in the same sentence, the government states that the figure of 2% reflects a collective commitment by the participating member states to spend 2% of their defence expenditure on research and technology. So what is it? What are they talking about? And I think we only have to look at the proposals by the Irish Navy to buy a new helicopter landing ship and that will be capable of carrying, I think, a battalion of troops as well. How is that going to be needed in terms of defence of Ireland's fisheries? Certainly won't be needed for that anyway, but that's what they're looking for. So this is a confirmation that Ireland will be diverting more and more state money towards EU military cooperation. And we can expect that this figure will increase over time with very little parliamentary oversight now that PESCO has been signed in. If you look closely, the budget is no small number. Under the plan, European governments will come up with 17 relativity projects, including a €5 billion fund for military research, along with an existing €100 billion in EU defence spending. Not only will we have to dedicate increasing amounts of our GDP to EU defence spending, but it will inevitably lay the foundations for the development of an EU army. PESCO is a platform for expansion. Its own annex states that a long-term vision of PESCO could be to arrive at a coherent full-spectrum force package in complementarity with NATO, which will continue to be the cornerstone of collective defence of its members. And many supporters of EU military integration have stated their ongoing support to see a defence component included in the next multi-annual financial framework, including a defence component. Annual regular assessments will be conducted by the High Representative of the Union of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy to ensure that Ireland is honouring and living up to these commitments as well. So just as we had the Troika monitoring Ireland's economic policy in the past, we now will have another EU agency monitoring our defence commitments and our defence expenditure, and we will have to live up to that. Military budgets should be 2% of gross domestic product, is what they're saying. If Ireland were ever to try to reach this, we would require a 5-fold increase in military spending. Another commitment is to spend 20% of our total defence budget on military equipment and research to fill strategic gaps in EU defence. And that goes back to the Navy looking to purchase a troop carrier as part of its refurbishment of the vessels that they have. PESCO also signs us up to intensive involvement in a future European Defence Fund. The purpose is to develop an EU arms industry so that profits can be made by companies who manufacture the means of death and destruction. As the journalist Peter Teffer said of PESCO, rather than a reflection of what security means and how to ensure it, the European strategy is dominated by developing and selling new capabilities. Supporting the defence industry has become a goal in itself. In relation to neutrality, Coveney's famous last words on PESCO was that it has no implications for Ireland's policy of military neutrality or the triple lock or the deployment of Irish forces overseas. But the implications of Ireland's neutrality do exist, and the government is already fully committed to participate as much as is legally possible within the confines of PESCO. Coveney again confirmed, where we must disagree, we will make our position clear. But this government is committed to participating in this common security and defence policy to the greatest extent possible, consistent with our values and constitutional provisions. Well, what does that mean? That to me sounds like they intend to bypass the parliamentary process where they can, and despite the misgivings from the opposition, ensure that they can participate as fully as possible. Now, of course, our neutrality is already compromised on a number of fronts. We all know that since 9/11, nearly 2.5 million troops have passed through the Shannon airport on their way to Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. And the airport has also been tied to dozens of CIA rendition flights where prisoners seized by Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan were shipped to various black sites in Europe, Asia and Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Irish companies are also participating in the multi-billion euro global arms defence market. Export orders linked to military armaments and defence industries were estimated to be as much as 2.3 billion euros a year. So we are already participating to that extent. And the international defence industry has also been given increased access to the Irish Defence Forces for product testing. While fully functioning weapon systems are not manufactured in Ireland, individual components, including software that comprises these systems, are being shipped from factories all around the country under Ireland's dual-use export rules. This refers to products which, though manufactured for civilian use, can also have a military application. Amnesty International has been raising concerns over Ireland's dual-use exports and their possible link to humanitarian abuses around the world for many years, and they point to potential loopholes in Ireland's dual-use export controls, where the end use of the item information can be listed as civilian. They can relate to the supply of components to civilian companies who then incorporate them into military systems. The logistical support for the US military and CIA at Shannon is already a contravention of Ireland's neutrality and is contributing to the huge death toll in Syria and other war-torn countries, including the mounting numbers of people fleeing torture, starvation, forced displacement and a range of other human rights abuses. PESCO has just validated Ireland's past military involvement while validating any future military engagements into the future, and that's what we have to be aware of and that's what we have to struggle against. And the estimated speaker goes stand
It's a disadvantage, obviously, coming next. There might be a little bit of repetition between us, but we'll try and do our best not to. I think a critic of the rise of the Nazis in the 1940s observed and noted one of the critical techniques used by Hitler and his ministers during their rule was to introduce their most extreme measures gradually, quietly, steadily, test the mood, see what the reaction is going to do. Somebody characterised it as only a single pill at a time, and then a moment of waiting to observe the effects of its strength, to see whether the world conscience would still digest the dose. And I think that perfectly sums up the situation we have regarding our neutrality. Because the question we're asked to discuss is, does PESCO damage our neutrality? We could maybe equally ask, does Ireland have a neutrality to damage in the first place, given the erosion that has taken place over the past period? And that's what angle I'm going to slightly look at. I'm going to hardly mention PESCO at all, because I know the next panel is going to do that. And I think I'm making the points very much in the context. We could not have had PESCO or got to this point without the chip that has taken place over the past number of decades, particularly escalating around the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, 02, 03, and so on. So we've been a long time getting there. I'd imagine most of this audience here is pretty well informed, but maybe some of the younger people wouldn't be. But we have the use of Shannon as basically a vehicle for the US military for many, many years now. As Tom Clonan called it, a virtual forward airbase of the United States that, as I say, really took off around 03. Clearly, rendition, Guantanamo Bay did lead to public pressure developing on the government at that time around issues of neutrality. With the release of the WikiLeaks cables in 2010, 2011, and I'd encourage anybody who hasn't studied the ones in relation to Ireland and this period to go and do so, because it gives you an amazing insight into how US-Irish relations work, and specifically how utterly spineless the Irish political establishment were in terms of defending our neutrality, and how much the United States were able to push the boundaries in that area. I mean, one of the cables reads, US military access to Shannon Airport in Western Ireland is among the most tangible benefits of traditionally strong US-Irish relations. For the United States, geography makes Shannon a key transit point for military flights and military contract flights carrying personnel and material to Iraq and the Middle East Gulf theatre in the global war of terror, as well as Europe and Africa. That's what the Americans say, and the Irish counterpart says, oh, there's nothing coming through Shannon. Now, we recognise, of course, that there are hundreds of aircraft coming through every day, 1 or 2 a day in terms of a military sense, and that's continuing, but they tell us that those military aircraft actually don't have anything to do with the military on them. There's nothing on them, there's no soldiers, there's no weapons, and they're not going near anywhere that there's a war going on. What they are doing, nobody's really sure, and the lads aren't going to ask, because what you don't ask or don't search, you don't need an answer for. So that's the military one, so our neutrality is protected there. Then, of course, the civilian ones, where yes, actually there is military personnel coming in on the civilian ones, but they get an exemption from that, and sure, their guns are kept below most of the time. That's the story there, and they get an exemption for that. So it's a complete duplicitous handling of the situation, where we say we're neutral, we're not facilitating anything, but nudge nudge, we really are, and we actually know we are. And I think it's very important to look at the period, I think particularly around the period of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq, because in some ways what the American establishment was doing was testing the Irish government to see how far they could push it with them. There was a couple of murmurings at various stages, like there were, I think Dermot Ahern was the minister at the time, and he very coyly sort of approached, and the WikiLeaks cable says this, the Irish ambassador, and said, you know, we're coming under a bit of pressure here with this rendition stuff. Would you mind at all if we could organise a few searches, just to kind of, you know, give the impression that we're searching? They actually asked them this, but they didn't even do that. That was even too much, to a situation now where they patently even refuse to do so. So the Americans were testing the Irish government, but the Irish government was also testing the public. And that's why we've got to the situation we're in today, a certain normalisation of the erosion of our neutrality. A place in Ireland today where on one day last month, no less than 7 aircraft contracted to the US military passed through Shannon on their way to the Middle East, and there wasn't a murmur from anybody in the political establishment. 7 in the one day with hundreds of military personnel. What does anybody think that they were doing, given the devastation and the destruction that's currently underway in the Middle East? Last year, 61,000 US troops on their way to and from wars in the Middle East were facilitated through Shannon. We know that regularly planes take off from Shannon to Djibouti, from where they launch strike forces and drone strikes on Yemen, as the US facilitate the Saudi war crimes in Yemen and the appalling famine there. And yet Ireland sits in the middle of that, facilitates that and nothing. So when we talk about damaging our neutrality, we have to look at that and see it very much in that context. And again, as I say, I just want to put this in context, because it's not just about Shannon. Our neutrality is being eroded in a broader context than that. I think we see it clearly demonstrated in the Fine Gael MEP little gesture last year, pushing their luck to see how far they could really go. Obviously with PESCO, which will be dealt with later. But we do have, as Thomas said, the government committing, we also have the government committing an Irish naval vessel and crew to Operation Sophia, which is not a rescue operation at all, but a military action. It's fair to say that the government wouldn't have gotten away with this in 2003. It would be actually unthinkable. And that's why I think those of us who are concerned about how far things have gone, but how much further they can go, really have to now start waking up to this issue and activating ourselves in a more serious way, because the EU establishment, pushed by the arms industry in their search for bigger profits, are in a certain way on the march, without overstating it. The efforts of Fine Gael last year to fly the kite on their position paper gives you a certain example, because what they came out with was to blatantly push the boundaries of acceptability, to redefine the concept of neutrality to independent, non-nuclear defence. They called it a position on security and defence that is open to active engagement in international security operations, one that calls for an increase in defence spending and demand, and of course that Ireland could access the defence budget, grabbing hold some of the $5 billion a year that the EU is going to be shoveling into the European Defence Fund. And it states explicitly that Ireland must be part of any European Defence Union. Now, why did a bunch of, no disrespect to MEPs, and especially not present ones, but why do a bunch of innocuous, no-name MEPs from Fine Gael that no one ever heard of produce this paper, and it's frontline news and we're saturation coverage about it? It's to test the water, and the media are testing the water, and they can do it in a way in which I suppose the political establishment at home can't. And that's the background to all of this. There has been a definite and deliberate shift away from the attitude taken by our defence forces politically and inside our defence forces over the past period, trying to cosy up to the big boys in Europe, moving away from our traditional field and what is still nominally the key role of the defence forces to protect our coastal territory in the main for the Navy, to protect and defend our country, to one where we really want to show the big boys in Europe that we can play those games. And it's all about money, and it's all about the arms industry, because, for example, we've shiny new equipment being bought. The Navy has a new vessel on the way. A new vessel, when we had for the first time, we know they haven't got the personnel to staff 8 vessels. Now they're buying a 9th one against that. We know, as Thomas said, they've had signed up to spend 200 million on a multi-role vessel that is a neutral state we don't need. It's a warship. Why would we need something like that? Of course, it's to ingratiate ourselves with the Europeans. We've had NATO warships welcomed into All Bowling on active duty over a past period of time. Again, it's normalisation. I mean, the spectacle in 2016 of a flotilla of Irish or of NATO warships being allowed into Dublin during the anniversary and the celebrations of the Easter Rising in 1916. The irony of a British warship sitting in the Dublin port during the centenary of those battles seemed to be lost on the people who organised it, but it actually took place. And probably the reason why it didn't bat more of an eyelid is it's becoming a bit of a habit. In 2013, we had a Dutch submarine visiting officially in Cork Harbour, a same submarine that had been involved in Operation Allied Force in Yugoslavia. In 2014, we had a German Navy training task group in Dublin port on its way to a NATO manoeuvre. We've had a US missile cruiser which had taken part in wars in Afghanistan and so on. It's docked up in Cove. Again, another US destroyer up in Cove. Now, they tell us, no, they're only visiting, like, sure, to give the people a look at what they're like so they can see. It might be nice to have a look, bring the kids along on a Saturday and all that sort of good stuff. But it's part of the normalisation. These are NATO-affiliated warships that have been allowed into our ports in recent years. A neutral country. Why would we allow that to happen? And why would there not be a massive outcry against that situation? Why do we have a situation? We have our Chief of Staff at the moment being brought off to New York for photocalls as part of Ireland's Security Council bid, applying to become the head of the EU Military Council and so on. We've the Department of Defence officials being in attendance at arms fairs in London, presumably paid for by the taxpayer. We could go on and on about this. But when we raise that with the present government, that this is a strategic move away, the shocking answer of the Taoiseach recently was kind of like, we're out in the Mediterranean, we're showing off to our European friends that we can be part of the big boys club. Don't insult the Navy by saying their job is to protect our coastal waters. Well, he should know better, because their job actually is to protect our coastal waters. And for the first time in our history, on 2 occasions since the summertime, our naval crews didn't have the crews to go out because they're too busy spending money on military hardware that they can't pay the men and women in the Army and the Navy a decent living wage, so that most of them are reliant on FIS and have no family life whatsoever. So that's the backdrop to all of this situation, and I don't really want to maybe go on much longer about it, other than to say is I think we have to see this. What's gone on here is a normalisation of the erosion of our neutrality. They've gone a considerable way down that road, and I think the reason why Luke has organised the meeting, the reason why the event that Roger will probably talk about later is being held, because those of us who are concerned about that need to now up our game and challenge that view to win back our ground, because the hearts and minds of the Irish public time and again have valued that neutrality. But ironically, and excuse the pun, it now has become something that we actually have to fight to protect and fight to preserve.
How's it going? Right, I too don't want to trying to avoid repetition. The question we were asked, does PESCO damage our neutrality? And the answer is yes. And as Clare has pointed out, it's pretty well damaged already, but this obviously is more damage to it, so it does damage our neutrality. A couple of weeks ago, there was a vote in the Dáil on Ireland signing up to the new Internal Security Fund. And it's only $2.5 billion to start. And Charlie Flanagan came into the Justice Committee and he told us that we're actually going to make money on this, because they're going to give us some money in order for us to be part of it. But what he didn't tell us was that the $2.5 billion that they were going to be handing out bits and pieces of, that was actually going to be collected from the different countries, and our contribution was going to be way bigger than what they were giving us. So that's just the kind of things that they do. But the fact that a handful of TDs in the Dáil voted against it, and everyone else was actually generally okay with it. And that's the problem we had with PESCO. Thomas asked, did PESCO come under the radar? Did the media not notice? Well, as Clare says, things have been pretty well normalised at this stage, that this is what we do, and this is all normal, it's all okay. And the fact that Shannon has been used as a US military base since 2001, and Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour, the Greens, the PDs, the Independence Alliance have no problem with it. They don't mind that we have an airport that's used by the American military, which goes on to supply bombs to others and to create havoc themselves. They engage in the destruction of countries that don't play ball with them, to such an extent that some independent research by an anti-nuclear group in America recently did a body count on Iraq and Afghanistan alone. And they claimed that the US military action in those two countries alone since 2001 have caused the deaths of between 1.3 and 2.1 million people who were not involved in any war. They weren't carrying guns. Now that's a huge number. But then, when the original war in Iraq in '91 caused untold damage and led to the deaths of 500,000 children, and in '98, when it was put to the Secretary of State at the time, Madeleine Albright, do you not think that 500,000 children, was that a terrible price to be paying just so you can control the price of oil? She says, oh, it was a terrible price, but it was worth paying. And things really have gone downhill ever since, and there's no one really shouting stop. Now, you have to ask yourself, okay, Ireland, I mean, why would they bother putting pressure on us to get involved with this thing called PESCO? Why are they wanting us involved in this internal security fund? Why is it so important for them that we're seen to be part of it by allowing Shannon to be used? Well, the funny part about it is that we really are just a small little island in the Atlantic, and in military terms, we don't really matter. But the point is that it does matter to the boys like the US, like the UK, like France, unfortunately like Germany, even the Italians, and more so than anything else now, really what's going on now is more about promoting an industry now than anything else. Last year, the Americans spent $610 billion on defense spending. $610 billion. This is a country with 50 million people at risk of poverty. Britain spent $47 billion in 2017. France spent 54, Germany 44, Italy 41. This is a lot of money. The Russians actually spent 66. So they're actually small fry in comparison to what the likes of the Americans are at. But this is a massive industry. It's one of the biggest industries on the planet now. And to his credit, a couple of weeks ago, when it was put to Bush, or not to Trump, now that the Saudis killed the Washington Post journalist Khashoggi, do you not think it's time to stop giving arms to the Saudis? And because of the massacre that's taking place in Yemen at the moment. And Trump says, well, I'm not so sure that's a good idea. Think of all the jobs. Think of the impact that it have. And in fairness, it was a pretty honest answer. Because when the same questions were put to Obama, Obama couldn't give a straight answer. And Do you know that Obama dropped an average of 30,000 bombs per year for these 8 years of presidency? It's a record for any American president. And the truth be told, Trump will probably struggle to beat it. Now, it also so happens that Obama deported 2.5 million undocumented migrants, which was more than every president in America put together before him. And Trump may actually struggle to beat that figure too. But Obama was good looking, he was intelligent and very articulate. Trump is as ignorant as a pig. And so people actually say, okay, I'm sorry, that reminds me of the pig and the fellow in the ditch. And the fellow walking by and says, you can tell a man's company by the company, or you can tell a man's character by the company he keeps. So the pig got up and walked away. But I mean, it's myself and Clare Daly have been to Iran and Syria twice, in fact, and Iraq in the last 18 months. And when you see what's happened to these countries, and all for what? When you see what's happening in Yemen today, and all for what? And when Ireland talks about, oh, we're only doing this and we're only doing that, and it's okay, we still have our neutrality, and it's the UN this and the UN that, and you throw in the UN here and there. Well, you know what? I'm getting pretty sick of the UN. And if you look at what's gone on in Yemen, in 2011, the powers that be decided that it was time for regime change in Yemen, and the UN bought into it. They eventually they were involved from the word go at regime change in Yemen, and they eventually sanctioned the Saudi UA coalition, backed by the US and the UK, and France now, and Germany as well. And they're literally bombing the living daylights out of Yemen. And the UN told us 2.5 years ago in Yemen that there's nearly 10,000 people been killed. Well, do you know that 3 months ago, the UN told us that nearly 10,000 people have died in Yemen, 2.5 years later. No one died since. The figure hasn't changed. Now, someone came out there a couple of weeks ago and said that the actual figure is around the 58,000 mark, but there's 1 million at risk of cholera, there's 8 million starving. I have a nephew that lives there at the moment. He's working in a hospital as a doctor, and it beggars belief what is going on in Yemen and how silent we all are about it. How silent the Irish government are about it. We still sit down and have scones and tea with the Saudis and the UAE. There was an Irish delegation over the UAE only 10 days ago, and so it was great, a great crack, and it was lovely. And yet, we refuse to sell beef to Syria, Iran and Russia now, but we're okay with the Saudis and the UAE. The Saudis will continue to do as they do because they can. Much the same as the Israelis can do as they do because we let them, and the Irish government are seriously complicit. It's scary to think that all the political parties that I mentioned, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and Labour, obviously the three main ones, but the Greens and Independence Alliance as well, the notion that they're okay with the complicity on our part in the slaughter of so many innocent people, for what? There is no rationale, there's no logic to it. They cannot make an argument for it. They tell us we need more security. After the attacks on France, and this came up in our debate at the committee when we were arguing about the Internal Security Fund. Oh, but the people of Europe deserve to be protected. We must spend more money on defence. There was a poll taken in France about 4 months after the attacks, and the majority of the French people, when they were asked, what should we do in order to make our country more safe? And the majority decision was we should stop bombing other countries. And after the Paris attacks, France bombed the living daylights out of a couple of cities in the region. There was more bombs dropped on Raqqa than there was on Dresden. For what? What happens when you drop bombs on someone's house? The man is usually not there. He's probably off working, or he's at war, or God knows where he is. But it's mostly women and children you kill, or the older people who are confined to the house. So you kill plenty of old people as well. But what happens to the mentality of the people that you bomb? How do they feel about it? What do they do from there? You make people very angry. You make people prepared to give their life, some of them, in order to get what they see as some sort of recompense for their family. They can't live with themselves if they don't do something for what happened to those that were nearest and dearest to them. And they are prepared to do anything to address that, and in respect for those that died. When are we going to start thinking about what's happening? Over 100,000 went on the streets before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Over 100,000 in Dublin. It was unprecedented. It looked like people cared. And you know what? A lot of people do care. Obviously, the politicians and the political parties don't. They have other things to do. They have other values. And obviously, the lives of people in these regions are not significant. They don't really count. The same as our media went into overdrive when Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. But it hasn't gone into overdrive about the fact that there's 8 million starving in Yemen at the hands of the same individuals. Why is that, I wonder? Why is there such a difference in the value of people's lives? What's wrong with us? Where did that come from? Is that going to change? Are we going to do something about it? The fact that we're not attached to mainland Europe, and I love mainland Europe, but we're an island. We have the great potential to be neutral. But there's only one thing going to make us neutral, and that's people like you. It won't be the politicians. Politicians never changed anything. Things happened, legislation changes under pressure from the people. Ye can change how we view what's happening in the world today. The militarisation of this planet is gone so bad, it's just soul destroying. We're destroying the planet. We're destroying the lives of so many million people. And we can do something about that just in our small way. Because as I started out saying, why do they want Ireland involved as well when we actually don't contribute anything from a military dimension? They like to have everybody on board. And it doesn't fucking suit them if somebody jumps ship. It doesn't suit the Israelis when we stand up in the Dáil and accuse them of genocide in Palestine. It really upsets them. And I say, why would it bother? It does matter. That's why your voice matters. And you should, every one of you, fucking contact 100 people that you know and talk to them. Let's change it. Thanks.
I will.
The Carja, agus gur míle maigad don Ming a sucht an cuara, agus an deise hort dem bheithan seo, agus fuirden Ming a rinne an túfas aibre chun an ócáide agrú, agus is iontóg a bheith reis an seo, áit a chaf mé cúpla blin, agus champas gáithangach ach nó tá sé nenam bheith mar campus gáithangach, agus tá mé tnú leis an lá go maiid sé I áréire agus is iontóg an rud a bheith reis. Faríor géir an ábhar atá faoi cabidéil agan tá sé ábhar tromcúiseach agus níl éon éalú ón ábhar sin. Ní féidir linn leanach de rá gan an tábhar seo a nochtú agus a nochtú an méid atá ag tarlú ó híomh cuasaí militas san Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, I'm delighted to be back in Galway, where I spent many years. I would like to say studying, but that wasn't quite accurate. That came later. And it's nice to be back in a bilingual campus, or theoretically a bilingual campus. And I want to pay tribute to Ming and his office for organising tonight. Also to the People's Movement and to PANA, because without them we would not be able to speak here tonight or in the Dáil. The amount of work and research that they've done on the ground on no budget, really, and kept us going. I want to say thank you to them. I also want to pay particular tribute to the group that I'm proud to be associated with, because I wouldn't like to be too depressing tonight in a sense. There are 7 of us with Independence for Change, and I have learned from Deputy Daly, Deputy Pringle, Deputy Wallace, and the other, Maureen O'Sullivan. I'll mention them all because it's really important to mention politicians that are doing good work and have the courage to stand up in the Dáil with nothing to gain, except our salary, which we earn and which is certainly a privilege. But it would be much easier for us not to say something. And so we have Maureen O'Sullivan, Deputy Joan Collins, and Deputy Tommy Bruin. I'm here tonight, and I'm not going into the details which I've written out because they've all been said. And 2 simple questions depending on which page you're looking at. Are we heading towards an EU army? Yes. Will it be called an EU army? I don't think so, because language is being stood on its head. Does PESCO damage our neutrality or what is left of it? Absolutely yes. Now, Politcher atá Kielwer ag am nóid seo bacordum sa síis because tháina ceistena freigra agam. A sensible politician would now sit down because I have the questions answered.
That doesn't exist.
That doesn't exist yet. So we're here almost to the day, 100 years after the First World War, the war to end all wars. The war that was followed by great silence. And here we are 100 years later with the same silence in relation to what's happening in Europe. And we're doing that, and we've joined PESCO, and we've committed to increasing the spending to up to 3%, or 2 or 3, depending on where you read it, of our gross domestic product. We're at 0.3% at the moment. And so we're into monopoly money. 200 million. I don't know what the figures are at this point. We mention figures in the Dáil. Sometimes they say they're not accurate. Other times they accept them. I don't know. So we're here where we're increasing our contribution to the militarisation of Europe at a time where those proudly serving in our defence forces have to rely on family income supplement. They're not earning enough to survive. They're not allowed protest, so they have to find imaginative ways to stand outside our Dáil and tell us we cannot survive on the money that we're earning. Just a few weeks ago, they stood outside and the people who had left the army and who were, I forget the official name for them, had a band, and they found an imaginative ways to tell us. Can you imagine that's what they had to do to tell us we cannot survive? And so we can't provide houses for our people, and we can't provide a health service. And every year at a minimum, more than 300 people die prematurely, specifically because of the time they've spent on trolleys. Where do we get these figures from? From the good consultants that go out on a limb to tell us this shouldn't be happening. But it is happening, and it's happening in our name. My role, and I think the role of my colleagues, is to tell you that. We are telling you that's happening. PESCO was not discussed in our Dáil. The good news is that 42 of us voted against it. That is good news. 42 of us stood up and said, you won't do this in our name. However, we didn't have the majority. Language has been stood on its head. We are heading for a militarised Europe, no matter what language you put on that. So if I take the document that Deputy Daly has referred to, it's a very easy document to read, and I absolutely recommend. It's Fine Gael, Ireland and the EU, defending our common European home. Now, many thousands of people in this country don't have a home, but the 4 Fine Gael MPs have come together to tell us that we should defend our common European home. And in very plain language, they tell us that our neutrality, it's worth looking at even the triple lock, that very basic mechanism that repeated governments have assured us is working. They tell us really it's time to change that, and we should look at a super majority of the Dáil. That's the type of language they're using to change it, or indeed to have the UN/EU, one or the other. That's all that's necessary. And so it's spelt out very simply here. And they tell me, and this is news to me, that the first duty of public representatives is to provide security for its citizens. The first duty of public representatives is to provide security for its citizens. I would have thought my first duty was to be honest, to stand up and represent people. I would hope that our police force would provide security when we sort out the police force, and the army when we pay them proper money. So it really is worth looking at this where language is turned on its head. One of my lowest moments in the last 2.5 years was to hear a non-elected man referred to as President address our Dáil. It was my lowest moment to watch the vast majority of the TDs almost bow down to an unelected president of a commission address our Dáil. Our president hasn't addressed the Dáil in his tenure of office. Perhaps in the next tenure he will, but a non-elected man has come from Europe and addressed us in the Dáil. It was great with difficulty that he listened to the Irish language on the day. Perhaps the fault wasn't his because he wasn't given earphones, and the Ceann had to tell him what I was saying on that particular day. We have reached a point in our Parliament where the Ceann, and I don't mean to be personal, but the Ceann has taken the trouble to write to each and every one of us as TDs to tell us who our friends were. So 100 years after the First World War, we now have the Ceann telling TDs and senators, reminding us who our friends are. And let me tell you, in case you don't know, China is our friend. And we have a one China policy going back to 1971. In case you don't believe me, this is dated the 23rd of October. Dear Deputy / Senator, and I won't read it, but he tells us that China is our friend. And we have a one China policy. And that means it's not Taiwan. So, as Ceann, I have no intention of telling Oireachtas members who they, as elected public representatives, can meet or what functions they can attend. That would never be my wish. However, I am aware that there continues to be engagement between some Oireachtas members and the Taiwanese authorities. This can cause serious offence and grave concern to our Chinese friends, and has the potential to cause serious damage to Ireland's developing relationship with China. And he goes on to tell us we have a one China policy. And then subsequently we have another little press report in telling us that the United Arab Emirates, also a friendly country, and really that the media have not reported the humanitarian aid that the United Arab Emirates has given to Yemen. And so I look at this and I think, madness takes on a new meaning. Language has taken on a whole new meaning. And as has been said by previous speakers, we are normalising war, and we are normalising the militarisation of Europe. We're normalising that we should give more and more money to defence.
We are normalising the fact that on this page, September the 12th, 2018, European Commission fact sheet. I draw your attention to it because why is the Commission proposing to reinforce the European Border and Coast Guard? And it goes on to give the facts. And what they propose is to have 10,000, what would I call them? I can't call them soldiers. I can't call them, we'll call them people. 10,000 people employed to defend the European borders. 10,000. And each country will send people to that, and then Europe will reward them by giving them money to replace those who they've sent. It really, Kafka takes on a new meaning when you read any of this. It makes Kafka seem easy. I'm sure some of you have struggled with Kafka like I did in my time. But it makes Kafka an easy read when you read this. And none of this has anything to do with war or military, not at all. It's 10 minutes, thank you very much. So it's to defend our borders. And why are our borders under threat? Has anyone asked why our borders are under threat? Well, the 3 MP, 4, is it 3 or 4 of them? I think one is about to go. Let me see, I can't remember actually. 4, and one is about to go, isn't that right? Okay, yeah. They tell us that we're facing all sorts of threat on our borders, the European borders, and that we have to stand with our friends in Europe. And not alone are we facing threats, but complex threats. Now, to me, as someone who's in the Dáil for 2.5 years, and prior to that 17 years at the City Council, the biggest threat that I see facing Europe and the world is the threat to democracy. And when I canvassed with other very good people in relation to not passing the Lisbon Treaty, we were demonised. We were demonised. I recall standing on the streets of Galway and asking people, who I won't name, did you read it? Did you look at what is in here for the militarisation of Europe? I was told, don't bother with that. I was told by another very radical person that the Fundamental Charter of Human Rights would sort all of that out. And so let me just quote now what a German defence minister is saying about the Lisbon Treaty. Recently, the German Minister of Defence, Ursula von der Leyen, declared that the structures that have been sleeping for a long time inside the Treaty of Lisbon have been activated. This means we now have a legal framework for a European Defence Union. We have a joint planning process so that as Europeans we can also develop a structure that tells us when we are going to use our forces. President Macron has also been quoted. He's gone further. In my quote here, he said, this was in August, he called for an almost automatic defence solidarity between European member states. Our aim is clearly for Europe to achieve strategic autonomy and reinforce defence solidarity. So what have I learned and why am I here as a woman and a politician? One cannot give into despair. It is a luxury we cannot afford. We are living in a safe country. Other people are not so lucky. They are the subject of decisions made in our name at a European level and with our friends, the friends in NATO, who decide the fate of people in other countries who are not lucky. If we are to do anything, it's to use our voice and to stand up and to take what information we can from those who are doing it on the ground, and I've mentioned 2 organisations already, and ourselves, to say, you will not do this in our name. We don't want war. The causes of war is not what you're saying. They're not terrorist threats causing war. War is caused by injustice, poverty, unequal treatment. And when we narrow language in the way that we've done it now, we are seriously in trouble as a democracy. And when we don't discuss things in our Dáil in an open manner, we are in serious trouble. Whether you like what we say or not, you must endorse the right for us to speak and have a debate.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Claire. And thanks to Mick. And now, as planned, a little bit later than usual, when is that ever not the case at one of these meetings, we're going to throw it open to the people who've come here tonight, and we're going to do it for about 20 minutes. And if you can keep it to questions. And this lady here at the front, if you want to introduce yourself. I know who you are, but...
It's interesting when Catherine's talking about language. Now, the one word that I have not heard from any of you, and I would like to know if you're willing to use it, and that is the word, we are pacifists, and this is not being used. Now, it's interesting. Vegetarianism, years ago, nobody was a vegetarian. Everyone now is a vegetarian. Even vegan. Until we get our word and our understanding, are we pacifists? Now, we have a tradition of pacifism because we had Chief Gettington, he was a pacifist. It's interesting that pacifism is never used now in this country. I was looking at a book, and it's a book by, and it's about Louis Bennett, who was a pacifist, and she was involved with Connolly, and she set up the Irish Women's Workers' Union. Now, she went to a conference, and this is the League of Nations in 1928. And who came to that conference for the first time but a Russian? And what was the Russian talking about? He was talking about disarmament and complete, general and immediate disarmament. And what did all our wonderful EU countries do? Oh, they fudged it. And in the end, nothing happened. But not only that, they not only fudged it, but they said to this Russian delegate, you are young, we are old. We have the experience of age. When you come back to us, stimulate us with the vigor of your youth, but to be guided by the wisdom we have won from experience. Now, this is 1928. Louis Bennett writes, the situation cannot remain as it is. The civilized world stands at the parting of their ways. A choice must be made between very definite progress towards the renunciation of war as an instrument of national policy and a period of militarism and competition in armaments which can only end in more atrocious wars than have yet been waged. And of course, 10 years later, is there we have World War II. So I would like for the word pacifism to be used. So all of us, TDs, are pacifists, and maybe also in the European Parliament, I don't know if any MEP comes along that we are pacifists. We are pacifists. Thank you.
Any you want to address that? Any of the four TDs there? Would you describe yourselves as pacifists? No. Thomas wouldn't. Claire would.
Yeah, unfortunately, though, it's easy to say you're a pacifist. I mean, most of the TDs in the Dáil would say they're pacifists, but they still have no problem with Shannon being used to kill people by the millions. So it's also just another word. It's easy to say you're a pacifist, but it has to be tested, and you have to reach the mark, and you have to show that you actually really are, and rather than just say it, which unfortunately is too easy.
I don't consider myself a pacifist, I consider myself an activist. I wish I was more active, and I'm constantly writing letters. And people have talked about the media as though they were asleep and passive. The media are very active in suppressing the sort of things we're talking about here tonight. Take it as something that writes a letter every day and gets one in every 3 months. Yeah?
Well, it's interesting, we hear an awful lot about fake news, but we never hear about the fake news of omission and leaving out stuff that's happening and not reporting it. That's actually worse than fake news.
No, it's corporate agenda, they're propaganda all. And it's a very, very sophisticated propaganda.
Thank you. Ask whatever you want of the four panellists who just spoke.
Do you know, I'm trying to ask you a question, I just want to point this out, and I appreciate this is great so far, and I really respect what you're doing. Do you know who owns this water bottle that you're drinking out of Deep River Rock? It's owned by Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, yeah. Do you know how long Coca-Cola has been involved with the military, the US military? 76 years. Have you heard about, do you know that plastic is made from oil? Have you heard about an oil war? Do you know Ireland is at the forefront of banning, it's been at the forefront of banning microbeads, yes, it's banning plastic bags. May I propose to you TDs a couple of things, right, that we ban single-use plastics, that we invest in bioplastics. Do you know there's a company in Cork making a plastic bottle out of seaweed, yeah? So we're an innovative country. And may I propose that we ban single-use plastics in schools, hospitals, government buildings, in pursuit of peace?
I think it's you make an interesting point about Coca-Cola there, but there's a man there with slightly shorter hair than me, and I understand that every now and then there's a company called Coca-Cola just try and get products to him, but I think he shows them the door, Mick, and he'd be right to do that. So listen, we'll go for someone here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the four TDs, why do they think our government are so spineless? Quite a few people in this room were at a meeting 2 nights ago where Senator Frances Black came to Galway. She has a wonderful bill which is completely legal. It's not BDS, which some of us would support, to ban Israeli settlement goods in particular from Ireland. And it never entered her head that Fine Gael would support it. She had a wonderful strategy with the makeup of the Shannon, that she got Fianna Fáil. Niall Collins went out there the week before and it was kind of a shock. Fianna Fáil supported, and with the numbers in the Shannon, it went through the Shannon. But, you know, we see or we hear so much about, say, Palestine in particular. The man in front of me here is involved in Shannon Watch. You're talking about the media. He doesn't get any coverage every month, as you know, you've all been there. They go along. The government don't reflect the views of so many people in Ireland on these issues. And I want to know why. It's funny, Mick, actually, you touched on the point there. There's probably not one Trump supporter in this room. But you did say, well, at least he's honest, but in Saudi Arabia it's not good for jobs. But why is it that Fine Gael, it never enters their head with their history of neutrality and what Ireland is supposed to be a symbol for other countries, like Palestine? They look up to us. If they only knew the reality of what happens in Shannon, for example, they'd have a different opinion. But why do you think that? Why are they so removed from what a lot of Irish people believe in?
Thomas, do you want to tackle that first?
I think there's 2 reasons for it. One is 2.5 billion in exports, and that's the reality of it. It's the same reason what Trump said about jobs. The government want to, if they were forceful, we would lose that exports, and they won't do it. That's the bottom line. That's what it comes down to, and that's why taking a principled stand will cost us, and will be something that we have to stand for and we have to fight for. But that's what we have to do.
People might have forgotten, but you might often wonder how come Ireland, how we weren't put in NATO a long time ago. In 1949, the Americans wrote to the Irish government and asked us to join NATO. My bride was the foreign minister at the time, and my bride was totally against it. And obviously, at the time, the main reason for it was he said he wasn't going into any coalition that involved a country that was occupying part of our island. In other words, the Brits was the argument used. That was in 49. In 51, the Yanks told the government that from now on, US aid, known as the Marshall Plan at the time, was going to be tied to defence policy. And that if Ireland didn't join NATO, that the aid would stop. In 1952, the aid stopped. And Ireland got no more money that time. Now, there would have been plenty of people. If there hadn't been any other foreign minister at the time other than McBride, it more than likely would have just tagged along and joined. And the truth be told today, the majority of Dáil Éireann would be comfortable enough with us joining NATO. That is the truth. They wouldn't like, they're probably, some of them, a lot of them are reluctant to say it, but it's the truth. They would be fine with it.
All right, two of you gotta go. This lady here.
Hi, I'm here tonight, I suppose, not just for myself, but also representing All Alliance Against Law. And I want to thank you very much for holding this evening and to the whole panel. And we've spent a good part of a week trying to build for tonight's meeting, going out, visiting the States. And I know that everybody here cares, and I think it's a good turnout, but if we'd gone back, say, to 2002, 2003, this room would have been packed. There would have been people standing at sides.
They weren't at a meeting on Facebook or some imaginary thing that kind of...
No, 2002 would have been here.
Yeah.
You know. And I know Mick said what we have to do is talk to people, talk to common people. We're talking to people every week on the street. It's really difficult to engage people now because a few will stop, a few will listen. A lot will agree with you, but they don't stop and don't chat. They just see what you're holding. But I know a lot of people have just got so much on the plate. They hear something briefly about an EU army. If you hear it on the radio at all, it's a sound bite, and then you'll get some intellectual or expert just saying, oh, we've got to take our place, you know, we've got to grow as a state, blah, you know, blah, blah, blah. Everything's really sound bites, and you don't really get to the meat. So I suppose what I'm asking the panel is, how do you think we're going to engage people? How do you think we're going to win their hearts and minds so that they care enough about this, that they actually want to feel strongly enough to do something about it? I've got my ideas, but I really want to hear the panel.
We go to Claire and Catherine for that.
Just saying to Catherine, geez, the two lads get the easy question. and we're stuck with this.
I'd answer it if you want to.
It's a very interesting and really spot-on question, and I think one of the reasons why there was such an opposition at the time of Iraq and Afghanistan was because people really felt that their action internationally could stop what they knew was going to happen, and then it didn't, and that really became in some ways a contributing, demoralising, or I suppose it contributed to a feeling of helplessness, the biggest protest ever in the history of the state, and yet the government were brazen enough to ignore it. So it kind of
declined it that we were marching for him.
You know, it was a kind of a throwback. I suppose. The difference now.
He did it in March on his bloody clinic, but anyway.
Is because it has somewhat been normalised. Somewhat, we've become so inoculated to it. So how do we overcome that? I suppose, well, you've got to start with the information. Even when it can appear difficult, we have to use the platforms that we have and the opportunities that we have as well. But I mean, other than that, I don't think there's any magic wand. If it's Luke, obviously, the better answer than that. So,
Catherine, do you want to say anything?
I think it's a huge challenge. I think every month the People's Movement stand outside the door. They do that. They educate us. I think it's a big challenge. I think, say, the water movement. People were galvanised across all levels, and gradually they were worn down by different initiatives within the Dáil and from the major political parties. They're experts at it, so that's part of it. The media is part of it, and just getting outlets. The housing crisis lately, 10,000 people protested. I think it was 10 more. Fianna Fáil went back in and voted for the motion. They hadn't put their names to the motion, but the actual power of the people on the ground made a change. But it's the continuing on with that is the challenge. I don't have an answer for you. We face it every day as politicians. Despite the good salary, you say every single day, I don't want this. So I think every human being faces that and still has to go. You have to find the thing. Finally, just to answer the plastic, I don't want to let it go, because we've had the Green Party, the two members in the Dáil are in the process, have brought a bill, initiated a bill in relation to plastics. We all supported them because of the slow process and really no help from the government. They were forced to bring a motion the week before last, and they actually tabled the bill. It's gone through the process, but it's paralysed somewhere, and they brought a motion, and we had a full discussion in the Dáil. Okay, full discussion means it was half empty, but those of us that participated.
No, but I just want to add, I thought, you know, in fairness, the Galway anti-war movement is more active than in other areas, probably because of the proximity of Shannon, and there does need to be more then, because actually, surprisingly, a lot of people don't know as well, and if they did, they would be more active, I think, you know.
Well, I just want to make one quick point in reply to your question, and you say that you stop people and you discuss the issue with them, right? What I would say to you is that every time you do that, you help, and you should get other people to do it as well. Noam Chomsky said once that every human being in the world can make the world a better place each day, and he says sometimes he says it only takes a smile. Every little thing helps.
I think that maybe the difference, like the water protests were mentioned, and I think the reason why the water thing went so well is because people weren't scared to talk about it. They didn't feel like they'd sound stupid if they spoke about it, that it wasn't too complicated for them. It's fairly simple, like, do I have to pay for me water or not? Are you in favour of it or not? And people could make that argument. But on this argument about militarisation and about our neutrality and the alphabet soup of all these different organisations that have been put together, to throw the alphabet in the air and pick the organisations out of it, it confuses the hell out of people. And I can say that for definite because it terrified me, the idea of talking about it. I was afraid I'd sound stupid, like I didn't understand what I was on about. And yet again this evening on RT News, Declan Power, when I had failed in all other aspects, he said, well, you know, the details, you don't understand the details. He never said what the details were, he wasn't willing to elaborate on it. It's a bit like dealing with the IFA and why they should give back the money to ordinary farmers. It's complicated. Well, as it turns out, it is not that complicated. And it's not actually that complicated when you delve into it. And okay, you're not going to get a massive reaction of most people that you walk up to on the street, but you're chipping away at it bit by bit by bit. And by the way, if nobody had turned up at this meeting this evening, it wouldn't be ideal, but it would have been worth organising it, because a couple of 100,000 people heard me talking about it on the radio this evening. Whether they like what I was saying or not, who knows, but they're probably talking about it now. There are hundreds of thousands of people at a virtual meeting on my Facebook page now, I wish they were here, and on my Instagram page, and on the Twitter channel. And there are, I'm not making it up, there are about 500,000 people who've seen that post. So it's bit by bit, we're nibbling away at it. And I hate this thing of thanking organisations because it doesn't sound very sincere, but to hell with me for not thanking PANA, and to hell with me for not thanking the People's Movement, because I get paid to do a job on this, and I have to say, without them, I would be bloody well lost for information over the years. So, look at, as Catherine said, we can't afford the luxury of despair, and I suppose the opposite of that is we might as well be joyous at what we're achieving, and we're achieving something. And all I know is if we didn't do this, we certainly wouldn't be achieving as much. And thank you. Your problem isn't that they didn't all listen to you. Your problem is you don't have 20 other people to help you. That's not caused by you, but that's the only problem you have, really. You know. Anyway, do you want to come back? You obviously do.
You see, I was involved in the water movement, and before it actually became a huge campaign, it took us ages going around the states, drip feeding information. I think when we're talking to people, you know what people are most interested in? And this is the truth. The money. What? We're spending that much money. We're going to spend more money. And we're being asked. People care about what we're spending money on, especially in the middle of a housing emergency and in a health crisis and everything else you mentioned. They really do care about the society. If you could just see that in black and white, and it's going in killing and investment in killing stuff. And the other thing we do care about, and I think even the plastic things brings this up, is environmental chaos. They really do. And I even think the whole idea of warfare feeds into that as well. And I just think if there was a way of doing what we did with the water, and that is giving people the information very plainly, very simply, meeting them where they're at, getting it through the door, and following it up and talking to them on their doorsteps, in the neighbourhoods, in the communities, and in the localities. But that costs a fortune. But I think that is actually the way that we could really engage people.
Thanks very much. Person there, their hand up for that, yourself, yeah?
Just to try and get back to the current segment, I've heard a lot of really good points on how our neutrality has been eroded in the past and how current leaders in the EU may risk, pushing towards the development of the EU army in the near future. But I haven't really learned from the current segment, how does PESCO in its current and proposed form down the neutrality?
You'll hear about that in the second panel, a lot more.
That was supposed to be the last 4 speakers, and I haven't heard those points discussed yet.
Okay. Do any of you want to say anything about that?
Sorry, really strong
PESCO damages our neutrality through, we have signed up to it, which PESCO is ultimately the EU going to go down the full road of militarisation. We've signed up to that. Now, Simon Coveney tells us that we've only signed up to that for certain things, not for a lot. But he'll also then push the boat out. And the reality is that he won't come back to us. He won't come back to the people here in this room. He won't come back to anybody to ask them about can they go further. And that's the problem. And that's the problem with
it. That's the argument that everyone puts forward for every change in every law and every debate that's slippery slope. That's the argument here for any change in any law. But I just want to know how
Look, we won't wall over the, we're going to ask one more question asked, and then we're going to move on to the second panel, and hopefully what you're looking for will be addressed there.
Just one point in reply to that gentleman, right? Just the fact that the government were very disingenuous with how they presented the PESCO thing, right? And just to make one point about PESCO, and despite the fact that the government were adamant that there was a voluntary nature to our involvement, there was no mention in the text of the PESCO agreement of any special provisions for Ireland or any other country that may not want to go to war. Instead, in the annex or list of ambitions and more binding common commitments undertaken by participating member states in the 5 areas set out by Article 2 of Protocol 10 of the Lisbon Treaty, it explicitly states in Section 12 that with regard to availability and deployability of the forces, the participating member states are committed to making available formations that are strategically deployable for the realisation of the EU level of ambition, and all countries must aim for fast-track political commitment at national level, including possibly reviewing their national decision-making procedure, which is double speak for doing away with votes when the hard decision has to be made. The Lisbon Treaty is actually crucial in relation to PESCO as to how it actually does tie us in militarily.
We'll cut that there. You have a minute to ask the question and you have 1 minute to answer.
Okay, one very simple question. Keep it short. Look, everyone in this world is
sorry, this man, well, you have a minute to ask. You've got going. Good go.
Everyone in this world, the media gets a certain level of brainwashing. Now, the best remedy for this, not for sale in Ireland, is for free on the internet. The myth of German villainy by First and Second World War by amateur historian. The professionals are liars and cowards, right? It tells the truth about the First and Second World War, not what the media says.
Do you have a question? Because we just got to stick it to questions because everyone here is opinionated. You wouldn't be here otherwise. So, and probably me more than anyone. But if you have a question for them, I'll talk to you afterwards about what you're talking about. If you have a specific question on what they said, you can ask it, please.
I thought there was questions from the public.
Yeah, this is if you have a specific question. Yeah, and I don't want to cut this man off. If you want to ask them a question, ask them a question. Yeah?
I want to give information.
All right. Okay. Well, if we can just go to a question, we'll come back maybe later on.
Okay, later on.
Okay. This man here. Numerous people have their hands up forever. It's painful at this stage. So, yeah.
So, well, about motivating people to listen, I have 550 students to teach, and last week I tried to squeeze in some of these topics into my lecture. The feedback was not so good, but it's still, we don't fight these things to win. We fight this because we have to fight. So,
yes.
The question I have here, Thomas had some answer. We saw, what is the motivation actually? We hear, right? We hear that the motivation is to protect the borders of Europe, whatever. But what is the motivation? When I was coming here, I had one thing in my mind. Is it Europe trying to be independent from NATO and be an entity as itself? I hear here, okay, well, there is the R&D motivation behind developing the European military industries, or is it just to cover up for the Lockheed development of F-35 that has cost $3 trillion? So we know all these companies are together, they have worked into.
So one of you gets a chance to address this. Who wants to do it? Okay, fair enough.
Go on. In a couple of words, the motivation is the expansion of the arms industry more than anything else. More than the expansion of the security industry. The people in these industries are lobbying harder than anybody else on the planet among our governments for a long time, and they are being successful.
Anyone else there want to say it?
It's the tail wagging the dog. Like, it's the European establishment that are responding to the international arms industry and securitization, surveillance, all of that.
So, is it arms industry within Europe?
We have to cut there. Sorry.
So within Europe, look after the European arms industry, that's what it's about. That's what PESCO is about. I mean, the European arms industry has an objective to compete with the American arms industry. We want to sell European guns to Saudi Arabia instead of American guns, so they can kill people in Yemen. It's okay if they kill them with European guns. It's not okay if they kill them with American guns.
What I hear is the motivation is to make us safer, apparently. And if it's to make us safer, I'd have to ask this question, because what they're asking us to do, they've been doing in Belgium for a long time. They've been doing it in France for a long time. When my kids went to school in Belgium, they had to walk through gates with people carrying machine guns. It's worked out so well. When we go down to Strasbourg, they have people guarding the city with machine guns walking around the place. And apparently it's going to make us safer if we go down that road. I don't see people walking around the streets here with machine guns. And apparently if we join in with that, then we'll be safer. So that's the logic behind it. The same logic as basically a chocolate fireplace, as far as I can see. Doesn't really add up. Anyway, listen, that's the end of the first panel, and I just want to thank them for coming, because believe it or not, some TDs do work hard for the whole week, so they've been working their ass off all week, and they really have. They actually do, and basically they're probably tired at this stage, so we're going to move on to the next panel. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Mick. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Catherine. You mightn't want to hear this, but you're bloody heroes of mine. Well done. Now, the second panel is basically, and the theme is meant to be what's happening with the militarisation of Europe. And we have three speakers, including myself, to sum it up. We have Dr. Karen Devine, lecturer in DCU. We have Roger Cole here from PANA. It isn't a type of ham from Italy or anything like that. It's the Peace and Neutrality Alliance. He's going to explain about that. And then finally we have Claudia Haydt, who is a board member of Die Linke, basically the left-wing party in Germany. So we'll start off with, first up to speak is Roger. Hi, Karen.
Well, first of all, let me thank Ming Flanagan for inviting me to address the meeting. He's got me staying in the Imperial Hotel. I hope that's not some sort of message.
It was.
First of all, a plug. We published this document. I brought them here. Hopefully, most of you have got a copy. If you haven't, just contact me later, and I'm sure that there's some of them all over the place. It's basically a document all about PESCO. And secondly, this leaflet, it's a leaflet about a conference being held in Dublin. Admission is only €10, and it's bringing together virtually all the peace movements in virtually every country of the world. Not every country, but like a very, very major number of peace activists. And I hope that some of you can make the effort to come along. Just to put it in, if you like, a historical context, in 1690, the Battle of the Boyne, the only issue was which British king would rule Ireland. And 100 years later, 1790, Wolfe Tone was the first politician, first political leader to actually advocate Irish neutrality, Irish independence, Irish democracy and equality. So for well over 200 years, you've had two separate historical values in this country. One group of people who supported British imperialism and the other who believed in the values of Tone. But in the last 25, 30, 40 years, 50 years, you've had a third group who give their loyalty to the emerging European empire. So you have three, if you like, conflicting groups. Interestingly enough, in the document that was referred to, the Fine Gael document defending our common European home, if you actually look at the cover, hands up which flag wasn't on the cover. Well, it was the Irish flag wasn't on the cover. Lots of other ones, but not the Irish one. And it's an indication of the thought process of the leadership of the Fine Gael party. Another example of that was when we helped to defeat the Nice referendum. The government had to set up, or decided to set up, this national forum in Europe. So as a direct consequence, I got to meet these European Empire loyalists. And I mean, as individuals, they're quite nice. And one guy is a guy called Charlie Flanagan, a very senior Fine Gael activist who was for a while the Minister for Foreign Affairs. So I said, look, whatever his name is, Charlie, look, all PANA is saying is for a very long time, thousands of Irish people fought and died for the army of the British Union. And all we're saying, why would we want to die for the European Union? And his reply was very clear, but we have to. Because he does not see himself as Irish. He sees himself as a European citizen. And a certain guy is a musician of some kind called U2, he lives there, he's a singer. He was waving the European flag because he does no longer sees himself as Irish, but as a European citizen. And if you are a European citizen, you are not a citizen of this country and you have to have your own army. And that's the whole basis of what this is going on. And there's a lot of support for it. At the last election, Casey, I know he got votes for different reasons, but he ended up with 23% of the vote. And he had publicly advocated that we should join NATO. In the occupied counties of the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, the DUP is totally supportive of NATO membership and totally supportive of the expansion of UK military equipment. So they remain loyal to that British imperial tradition. The Fine Gael and the Fianna Fáil parties are totally supportive of this US of Ireland being a de facto US aircraft carrier. 3 million US troops have landed in Shannon and we don't know how much military equipment on their way to these perpetual wars. And of course, the new enemy, the one that's far more important because you need more weapons, is Russia. And of course, now that they have done away with or reneged on the Intermediate Range Nuclear Weapons Treaty, because Ireland is a US aircraft carrier, we are now a potential target in a nuclear war. Not content with that, for decades now, not just in the last week or so, this country, in treaty after treaty after treaty, is being integrated into this emerging European army, European empire. They use the phrase, the government used this phrase, quote, military neutrality. The only reason why they use that particular phrase is they know that a large and significant number of people are still loyal to neutrality. But of course, it doesn't mean anything in terms of being neutral. In fact, what really happened, you know the way, like the old story about a frog. If you put a frog in cold water and slowly heat up that water, the frog dies without even knowing that it's happening. And that is exactly the situation with the Irish people, because they keep on voting, whether we like it or not, for parties that support this process. You cannot be a neutral country and a US aircraft carrier at the same time. You cannot commit yourself to the integration into an emerging EU army and EU empire and be neutral at the same time. It's not actually an option. Now, as I said, this happened in treaty after treaty. So, don't believe me, I'm not going to go through every single EU treaty. You'd be here for about 5 hours, if not longer. So I will just focus on the key ingredients of the last treaty. This is the Lisbon Treaty. It actually created a new position of a Minister for Foreign Affairs for the European Union, with responsibility for foreign security and defence policy of the European Union. And they also have a large and growing Department of Foreign Security and Defence Policy. The two core institutions that have been established before, which is the European Union battle groups and the European Defence Agency, were recognised as in legal terms as part of the European Union. The tasks these EU battle groups were given were expanded to include, and I quote, combating terrorism and the option to conduct preemptive military action against perceived threats. It also established the PESCO. In other words, this allows individual member states, groups of states, to form different military formations. Ireland has joined PESCO. Now, it's only a small bit, right? This goes back to the frog theory, right? You just bring them in a little bit. So people say, oh, that's nothing. At the same time, many of the other European states are forming much larger and much more powerful military organizations. Like the Germans have got brigades of armoured tanks to take part in their emerging force, and other countries as well. So they now will have in the next year or so, a German-dominated European Union army of 20,000. Now don't forget, every one of those 20,000 you send abroad to take part in a war, you need 9 people backing you up. And a ratio, that's the core ratio, because people get ill, they get angry, they get killed. So you need to have the number of people you could send is backed up by a much larger number of troops. And believe you me, a 200,000 strong EU army is a EU army. Now, the other reality is they established mutual solidarity defence clauses as part of the Lisbon Treaty. In other words, they're more powerful in many ways than the mutual clauses of the NATO organisation itself. So if Britain attacks somebody, and somebody attacks, or not Britain soon enough, but up to legally, even now, if Britain was attacked, they could call us now to go and help defend them. And so it certainly will be France and Germany and the rest of them. Now, the support for these policies aren't new. They've been around for a long time. Let me quote to you a report in November 2006 of the EU Parliament. And they voted for this by 14 votes to 177 against. It highlighted the links with NATO. It supported the development of the European Union into a security and defence union, establishing a common market for military, and to create an EU navy. Why do you think the government proposed that the Chief of Staff of the Irish Army become the chair of the EU Military Committee? To make the tea? No, it's about committing the Chief of Staff of the Irish Army to this emerging EU army. And part of that deal, now he didn't get the job because, he didn't give enough, but what they did do as part of the deal was agree to spend €200 million on a troop carrier that would be able to carry 800 Irish soldiers, which is about all they can do at the moment, to take part in an invasion. It's a ship specifically designed to go to war, nothing to do with fisheries, and to take part in a naval exercise, perhaps to invade and take over Libya. And I'm not making it up. Macron, the French leader, has already said that's one thing that the European Union can do. And only, yesterday or the day before, he was calling for the creation of a real European army. Let me quote again from the same treaty. A more assertive union, European Union, role in security and defence matters will contribute to the vitality of a renewed Atlantic alliance in accordance with the Berlin Plus arrangements. So the policy of military neutrality means, in reality, renewing and revitalising a nuclear-armed military alliance. It is therefore no surprise that the German Parliament commissioned a report in July 2017 that determined that Germany could finance British or French commissioned nuclear weapons programs, and the EU could do the same if it only changed its budgeting rules. Because what is the point of a European empire having a European army if it also doesn't have an army that's armed with nuclear weapons. After all, the Americans have it, so they're an empire. So why can't we have them? Now, you see, these are realities. I'm not making all this up. This is what's actually happening. So why is it that you know, this isn't talked about? Give me one little hint, right? PANA makes a great deal of money every year, right? And it has a huge turnover of €5,000. The major institution that advocates and supports PESCO is the International for the Irish International Institute for Europe. Sorry, hope I get this right. It's the IIEA, right? The Irish International for European Affairs, right? Irish and International European Affairs. Yeah, I got confused. Easy enough. Anyway, its income per annum is slightly bigger. It's €1 million a year. Now, what do they do with that 1 million? I'm damn sure they take people out for very, very nice lunches, at the very least. In other words, this is not an equal fight, you know. This is the flyweight against imperialists. About people who want and are committed to and dedicated to dying for the European empire. And they want you all to do it as well, because, of course, you're all frogs. You don't know what's going on. It's all happening. Not you lot, maybe. But, I mean, huge numbers of people just don't know this. And it is money. But it's also dying. This year, we're marking an event, the end of the war to end all wars. It didn't do that, of course. But, I mean, it's supposed to be a fantastic war. And we should be grateful. We all died for it. Our parents did, our great-parents, our parents. You know, I mean, there's no critical analysis at all in the media of this horrific imperial war. And that's part of the deal. Because if you build a huge wall where you put people who died fighting for independence on the same wall as people who fought against Irish independence, you don't make any distinction. And that's happening up in Glasnevin as we speak. So in the next year or two, they'll be putting up the names of black and tans right beside the names of the people who fought for our national independence. Because they don't see any distinction. And that's all part of this continuity of a willingness of a political elite to ask that we should first of all die for the British Empire and next we should die for the European Empire. Now, you see, 2 minutes left, and we've just been told, so I'm going to quickly finish it off. We have to oppose this. Because if we don't somehow or other knock off with the pan, right? Do what we can to make people realize what's happening, then the consequences are not good at all. Not just for people in Aden who they're helping to kill, not just for the people in Iraq or Syria or the Ukraine or wherever. We'll be the ones who'll be doing the dying, because we'll all be convinced that U2 is right, that we're all European.
Yes, I will. But
Vielen Dank.
hi, I'm just waiting for some help with my presentation, but welcome. and thank you very much for inviting me. Okay. So can I get?
No.
Well, at least on this evening, I have the pleasure to have had the longest way to arrive here. Well, from Dublin, but also from Berlin. And I'm a long-time activist campaigning against European militarization. And we've been doing this now for many, many years. And yes, there is a kind of sleeping beauty. But for me, I refuse to call an army or a military structure a sleeping beauty. For me, the sleeping beauty is those people who can stand up and fight against this kind of militarization. And I've got the good message to give to you that a majority of people in Germany actually are opposed to using military force to get over their political ambitions. But on the same time, they are very much asleep to the nature of the European Union. They see European Union as something inherently good and whatever. But as we are sitting here, we know that it is not. And if I tell you now about the German ambitions with regard to European Union, you have to know it's not the people in Germany. It's our political elite, it's the military elite, it's the economic elite. So we've got the same question everywhere, how to alert people. But I did take a gamble with my first slide, as I had to prepare it yesterday, and Manfred Weber was only elected today as the Spitzenkandidat, the leading candidate of the European People's Party for the next Commission President. Be assured it's not my president. He is very good friends with Macron, and he is one of the supporters of this real European army. I brought you a quote of Manfred Weber, in which he wants to explain to us that we have to build a strong, assertive Europe. I would call it an aggressive and a colonial or neo-colonial Europe, but surely not something like a positive assertiveness. He tells us that we need to have a common defense, and that Europe must be able to defend itself. But people here have asked, why do we need this kind of militarization? And I think there is a simple answer. The simple answer is that we refuse to start to build a fair world order. A world order which is not dependent on exploitation and which actually tries to deal with people on an equal basis. But we are conserving this kind of exploitation and rivalry between different blocks of imperial powers. This is why we need the army. If we tried to change the game, we could also leave with armies, but this is not on the agenda in Germany at the moment. So what I brought to you is a picture of where the German army is deployed at the moment, and it's not a complete picture. Dark blue, you find all the different deployment areas where our German parliament decided our German troops should go. It's about 3,000 German troops worldwide. But actually you find some light blue pictures, which are deployments which have not been decided by the German parliament. And actually, we are experiencing in Germany that the parliament loses the control. The army should be controlled, it's in our constitution, by the parliament, but we have up to 20,000 soldiers, German soldiers abroad, but only about 3,000 of them there has been a parliamentary decision. And this problem is going to increase the more we go to European level decision-making processes. And this is what the German elites want. They don't want to have these stupid discussions in parliament. Okay, we never had a majority opposing opposing any kind of deployment of troops. But we had many occasions where there was nothing brought to the vote because it was clear there would be no majority. So it was clear Germans wouldn't agree, even the conservative politicians wouldn't agree to have German troops attacking Libya. So they didn't bring it to the vote, and they didn't decide on it. But afterwards we learned that up to 100 German officers actually helped in the war against Libya. There was no decision on this, there was nothing, it was just that they've been in the staff of different other NATO countries. And this is the same process we now experience with European Union. There are so many institutions that we are kept totally in the dark of what's actually happening and what's actually done and who is actually responsible for anything. So you might know that to do this kind of military deployment costs money, a lot of money. And if you ask people in Germany where they want to spend money on, and if we have to do some cutbacks with our budget, where do they want to cut? And everyone says, okay, with the military we can save. We don't have, we need more money for healthcare, education and so on. So there is a majority for this kind of good investment and a majority against investment in the military. But the contrary is decided on. Here you see the figures of what the German decisions are to spend money on. And you have to know that Germany, well, you should do know that Germany is the biggest economy in Europe. So if we talk about 2% of the GDP in this biggest economy, we talk about a lot of money. And what is currently discussed for 2019, for the next year, is if you talk about it in NATO categories, well, they do always tricks like hiding money for the military, but it's 46 billion euro for 2019. And this still is only 1.3% of the GDP. So it's far away from 2%. But there is a plan to get up the military investment to at least 1.5%. This would mean 60 billion euro. And also our conservatives and the fascists, the so-called Alternative for Germany, are very strong campaigners for at least 2%. This would mean 80 billion euros spending in Germany on the military. And many of you might know that the argument for this increased investment in the military is Russia. Russia is threatening us and so on. Okay, they might not be the best neighbors, but actually they decreased the military spending in the last year, so that at the moment it's only 58, only, well, it's too much. Everything spent on military is too much from my point of view, but they spent 58 billion dollar, not euro, at the moment. It was more in former years, but they actually cut down their spending. And if you continue with the ideas I put out here, which are already enshrined in our budgetary law, you see that in the next year we will see a Europe, and I don't speak about the European Union, but a Europe in which Germany is the strongest military power, which was never, never, ever a good message for our neighbors. Never, ever. And as I pointed out, it is done explicitly against the wish of the people in Germany. Actually, I don't understand why they vote, the parties which decide for it, but this is another thing. I think it's the same problem in every country. So we see Germany as the biggest economic power. We see Germany as the biggest, at least evolving, biggest military power. And also we see Germany in European terms as the biggest political power. All of you know that, well, okay, European Parliament is going to finance a lot of things for the military, for the European army, but the decision-making process is done in the European Council. And actually already through the Lisbon Treaty, the political power of Germany increased a lot. And so far, most of the decisions regarding foreign policies have been done by consensus. But through PESCO already consensus is weakened. Mostly it's within PESCO, the decision-making process is qualified, so-called qualified majority. But there is also the discussion at the moment brought on by European Commission to change all the decision-making process with regard to common foreign and security policies into qualified majority procedures. So, and if you think about this complicated process of finding a qualified majority, it's very important how big is the voting power of each country. And just to translate it, it will be nearly impossible to make a decision against France and Germany if they are united on a special topic. And it will be very easy to make a decision against Ireland. Very, very easy. So if Britain is leaving, the German voting power increases. So thank you to London for this decision. You can see it up there from the pre-Lisbon Treaty situation where Germany had 8.4% of the voting power. Now it's going to be 18.3% of the voting power in the Council. And okay, for Ireland, the voting power also increases through the Brexit. It's going to go up from 0.9% to 1%. So you don't need any kind of mathematical skills to understand that the smaller countries don't have anything to say, they just have to pay. And, well, they're going to have to pay a lot in this thing. I just give you one example, and it's also an example of how Ireland is absolutely losing its neutrality if it ever had it in the last years. NATO is building 2 new command structures. These command structures actually mostly deal with mobilization to bring military power to the front lines against Russia. One of those 2 command structures is going to be built in it's actually in the process of being set up in the US, and one in Germany, in South Germany. It's actually close to my hometown in Ulm. You can see it here. It's called Joint Support Enabling Command. This kind of military speech where you don't understand anything, but it actually means we organize the mobilization of tanks and other military equipment to be able to fight against Russia. So in the US, they collect all the military stuff and then also collect, for example, in France, in Spain, in Portugal, and in Ireland, maybe. Whatever there is to collect for a European army, send it through Europe to the Russian border. But there is a problem for this kind of mobilization, that is the very bad infrastructure, civilian infrastructure in Europe. So we have bridges that are not able to support even lorries and not even tanks. We have no longer any good infrastructure to load up the tanks on trains. We have streets which are not able to hold the tanks and so on. So there has to be a lot of spending with regards to enable this military mobility. And this is what the European Union is paying for. They got this program for military mobility, spent billions of your taxpayers' money to enable the support, to enable the tanks to roll freely through Europe, to the Russian border. So NATO and European Union actually work hand in hand. And they do it not only like occasionally, but it's part of the structure. And I think this means I have to come to an end.
Well,
does it?
I was just about to tap the glass, but it did it for me. So.
Okay. In any case, I want to point out that we have to, if we talk about a European army, we have to see the bigger political picture. It's not only a bad message for foreign policy, but we are talking about like poverty, war and repression internally and globally. So if we talk about armies which are equipped to fight against populations elsewhere, those soldiers can come back and can be deployed against people on strike and can get sent not only on the streets to protect us, but also to force us to do whatever our governments want to have. So if we say we are against this kind of neo-colonial wars, I think we also protect ourselves here. And those structures I mentioned as reasons for those wars and for this kind of militarizations, those structures of inequalities are the ones we also find at home. So if we join our fights, join the fights for better housing, for better healthcare, together with the fight against the military, I think maybe we can become stronger in this way. So, well, let's explain to people, if we spend the money on the military, it will not be there anywhere else. And if we spend the money on military, which means we fight for injustice, and actually we shouldn't do this. Thank you.
Well, indeed. My name is Devine. I'm a lecturer in International Relations and European Union Politics at Dublin City University. It was a little bit later here than 7 o'clock because we had a graduation. And then I got stuck on the car park that is the M50, but I'm delighted to be here. I just want to thank Ming Flanagan, MEP, for inviting me to speak, and to thank all of the other panellists for their contribution, and to thank all of you for coming out to actually because you want to hear about this. And this is really important because everything that's being said is absolutely true. I'm going to add a little bit to it. I basically want to discuss, or I'm going to give the answers to 3 questions. The first question is, where did this idea come from? And perhaps that might answer your question about motivations, the question from the audience earlier. The second question was, when we think about the creation of the security and defence policy of the EU, was it actually done democratically? And then the third one is, well, what are the future plans? What is the end game for this? So when we think about where we are today, where did it all start? Well, it started back in 1952. The Korean War had broken out, and the Americans were looking to essentially put a lot of resources east. They wanted to contain communism. And so they approached the Marshall Aid countries in the wake of the Second World War, the Marshall Aid countries in Europe, and they said, how about you put together a European army so that at least when we're busy over there trying to contain communism, we don't have to be here in Europe. And so this was named the Pleven Plan because it was written by the French foreign minister by the name of Pleven. And this was discussed in the capitals of the original 6 of the European Coal and Steel Community around 1952. In the end, the plan went nowhere because the threat really didn't manifest further west, and the French Parliament didn't actually debate the proposal. So they didn't take a vote on it, and it failed there. But that was the initial reasoning for a European Defence Community, or EDC. So I want to then fast forward to 52 years later, and the French foreign minister then was a guy called Hubert Védrine. And what he said was, we have to plan for the future. And remember, this is in the wake of the Second Gulf War, the Iraq War, 2003, and then Afghanistan. So a couple of years after that, 2005, and he's saying, America is just too strong. He called it a hyperpuissance. Hyperpower. And he said, we need not to have a unipolar world, but a bipolar world. And that other pole is going to be Europe. And it's going to be driven by France. Because France has imperial ambitions, and it sees a way of realizing those ambitions by using the European Union as a sort of a multilateral facade. time and time again, you'll see it's the French that are actually driving forward the common security and defence policy. And traditionally, it had been Britain who was exerting an influence on the French, who didn't want this to happen because they saw it might rival the US, NATO. And they wanted to preserve their relationship with the US, and so they wanted NATO prioritised. So, to my second question then, in terms of how the security and defence policy that we are now looking at, that is contained in the Lisbon Treaty, was that done democratically? Ireland is a neutral state, and part of being neutral means that, amongst other things, and you can look it up in the Hague Conventions of 1907, you can't have foreign bases, you can't allow the transit of troops through your territory, but also you're not allowed to put yourself in a position during peacetime where you're going to have an obligation of aid and assistance to another power, to another state. Okay, and that's what happens through NATO, Article 5, the Washington Treaty, which established NATO in 1949, has a mutual defence clause. But just before NATO was formed in 1948, there was actually a little mini European version of NATO. And that was called the Brussels Treaty Organisation. And the Brussels Treaty, Article 5, also had a mutual defence clause. If one or more parties are attacked, all other parties shall have an obligation of aid and assistance by all means in their power, military or other. Okay, so that's what it said. If one state is attacked, all others have to come to their aid and assistance by all means in their power, military or other. So, what happened was, in 2002-2003, they wrote the Constitution for Europe. That then became the Lisbon Treaty as we know it now. But at that time, Michel Barnier, who you're probably familiar with through Brexit, was asked to head a group that was given the task of putting together, writing the draft clauses for security and defence policy going forward. And what they proposed was, and this was always hanging over various treaties, because when the European Union was established through the Treaty on European Union in 1993, they created clauses that said that it might have a common defence in time, but the Lisbon Treaty changed that to it will have a common defence. What is a common or collective defence? Under the glossary of terms of the European Union, it is signing up to an Article 5 mutual defence clause contained in either the Washington or the Brussels treaties. The Germans and the French wanted to basically subsume the Western European Union military alliance so that the EU has its own military alliance. This was actually said in Train in December 1999 by the European Council, the heads of government. Bertie Ahern was the Irish Prime Minister at the time. In Cologne, I think, they decided that they were going to merge the Western European Union with the EU. Okay? So how we got that mutual defence clause was that it was taken from the Brussels Treaty and it was put into this constitution. It was only supposed to be there as an opt-in. It wasn't supposed to be part of the whole body of the text of the treaty, which if you sign up to it as a state, you're obliged to follow everything that's in the treaty. It was in a protocol, which is like a little side document attached to the treaty. So if Ireland signed up to the Lisbon Treaty as it became, and this mutual defence clause was in this protocol, neutrality technically, at least the bare bones of not being a member of a military alliance, which is the only thing that military neutrality actually means, it doesn't mean not get involved in wars. So what happened? How is it that we ended up signing up to this mutual defence clause? Well, there was a political sleight of hand, because essentially it was taken from the protocol and put into the text of the treaty. And the Irish government reacted quite badly to this because it was supposed to be in the protocol and neutrality was supposed to be safeguarded. And so did Austria, Sweden, and Finland, because they were also other three neutral states. So what happened? Well, on the 5th of December 2003, Brian Cowen wrote a letter on behalf of Ireland, Sweden, Austria and Finland. They wrote it to the Presidium, or at least the presidency of the EU, which was held by the Italians at the time. So each country has a 6-month rotating presidency where they run meetings. So the Italians were overseeing this Barnier group putting together these treaty clauses on security and defence policy. And what the Italian foreign minister did, Franco Frattini, was he took it from the protocol, put it in the text of the treaty, gave it to the governments. The Irish government wrote a letter saying, listen, we have to have a referendum on this. This is basically going to violate our neutrality, so we can't sign up to this. We propose a change in wording to this mutual defence clause. So instead of having an obligation of aid and assistance, by all means in your power, military or other, how about we turn it around and we say, if a member state is attacked, it has the right to ask other member states to provide aid and assistance. Okay? So basically it made it no longer obligatory. It wasn't a mutual defence clause. Okay? It took away the automatic obligation to aid and assist, which is what all military alliances are based on. So this letter was received by the Italians and they passed it on to the three major powers of the UK, France and Germany, who got in a room, discussed the letter and said, no, we're not going to agree to this. So what they said was, look, the clause says, aid and assistance by all means in your power, military or other. How about we just delete the words military or other? Brian, you can put that to the Irish people in a referendum. We've semantically demilitarised the clause. It sounds better. And we'll give you the Irish clause. What's the Irish clause? Nothing in this will prejudice the specific character of the security and defence policies of certain member states. Now, the Irish government have always said, oh, that means neutrality is safeguarded. It does not. In fact, in the Lisbon Treaty, it means the exact opposite, because it's no longer the Irish clause in the Lisbon Treaty, it's the British NATO clause in the Lisbon Treaty, because that actually then refers to NATO. And it says that it won't prejudice the specific character of certain member states' security and defence policies. And then it says, this is what the British wanted, NATO is primary. So we will only trigger this Article 5 mutual defence clause that's in the Lisbon Treaty. Now it's Article 42.7 of the Treaty on the European Union. We'll only trigger that mutual defence clause if NATO's is not going to be triggered in the first place. In other words, if the Americans don't want to get involved. So it was completely undemocratic how this happened, and it was against what the Irish government at the time and the other neutrals wanted. You might ask about the democratic nature of this, in that, okay, so a mutual defence clause is there. Obviously the Irish government ran a campaign of misinformation and wouldn't admit to this mutual defence clause being in the Lisbon Treaty. I now know this because the Irish Times asked me to write a series of 3 articles in the Irish Times, an op-ed, and the third of those 3 articles said, basically, the EU is turning into a military alliance. It's subsuming a military alliance. And of course, the government rolled out the usual suspects, Noldor, the International Institute for European Affairs, etc., to say, this does not prejudice Irish defence policy. Well, I wasn't talking about Irish defence policy, which is whatever Leo Varadkar decides it is over his cornflakes every morning. I'm talking about neutrality, which is a legal concept defined in the Hague Conventions, which 4 in 5 Irish people actually support. So, I looked at the 2016 Eurobarometer, which is a survey of every single 28 of the 28 member states, a representative sample of the public. Can you guess what percentage of all Europeans are aware of the Mutual Defence Clause and understand what it is? A percentage. Go for it. Throw out some numbers. 36. 39. 15. 15. 12. 12%. 12% of Europeans are aware of the Mutual Defence Clause and know what it is, understand what it is. Now, José Manuel Barroso declared the Lisbon Treaty to be the most significant treaty that the European Union had ever produced. And he said, because it will allow the EU to shape globalisation, it will allow a common defence, and it has a mutual defence clause. Those were the 3 things he said about the Lisbon Treaty. So they trumpeted the Lisbon Treaty for the mutual defence clause, and yet only 12% of Europeans know what it is. And the French, who were the first to trigger this clause in November 2015, in response to the Bataclan attacks, only 6% of French people know and understand what the Mutual Defence Clause is. So is this democracy? Is this public awareness? I think not. How many minutes do I have left? 2. Okay. So let's go to my third question, what are the future plans? We've already heard about, you know, German defence spending. What is it? It's going to be 43.2 billion in 2019. And by the way, the cap defence expenditure is roughly 50 billion. So that's like spending the cap every year, just by Germany every year. And NATO spending 46 billion. Well, the EU, the European Commission, launched a European defence kind of white paper and European Defence Fund. This is an article that is a press release, and it talks about 5.5 billion for a new EU defence fund and procurement. So what's it going to spend on? Technology, arms, munitions. So that's 5 billion a year from 2020. And in total, the European Defence Fund amounts to 37.5 billion. Okay? So that is money from my pocket, your everyone's pocket. All Europeans are going to be paying into this. So we will have blood on our hands when those arms are used against Yemenis or whoever. Also, let's go back to the motivations. Jean Monnet, who's considered the founding father of European integration, wrote this big, thick memoirs, and he actually said, I have never believed that the problem of Europe will be solved through defence. But when the European community, defence community was floated, he was having a discussion with one of the French diplomats in the Foreign Service, and he had agreed with what that French diplomat said. He said, well, if we can get this common European army, we will finally realise the ultimate task of Europe, which is to take Africa. Okay? So, to finish off then, when you look at what Federica Mogherini has said, when PESCO was launched, and even her latest speech in March of this year, she said, we are now going to be able to have military operations far outside the borders of Europe in Africa. And she cited 3 places in Africa where the EU can now go. And this is about French military ambitions. Now that the UK has gone through Brexit, this was the catalyst for the French to push forward with the European Defence Union. And my very last sentence, I promise, is basically from the German Foreign Ministry. This is it. Yeah, it says, stronger together thanks to PESCO. And they say PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, they call it a European Defence Union. And they also say it's an alliance. Here, how will the alliance be realised? And it says the individual PESCO armies will be pooled to address common threats. So, you know, if it walks like a duck, sounds like a duck, and what's that other thing? I don't know, the third part of that. It's a duck. Yeah, so quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Well, they say this is not a European army. That's exactly what it is. It's a conglomeration of national forces, and in the protocol that describes PESCO, it says that will act in accordance with the principle of a single set of forces. Now, if that's not an army, I don't know what is. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. I have one thing to do and a few things to say before I put it out to questions. When I came here today, I had a task of telling you all about what this was about, and in an attempt to put that down on paper, each and every point that I approached, I thought to myself, one of these is going to bring it up, and there's no point in repeating ourselves. But there is something that hasn't been said here tonight, and I think we do need to talk about it. And that is that at the moment there is a big push, and a very popular push in the European Council among the European Union governments to increase our contribution to the European Union from 1.1% of GNI to 1.3% of GNI. And that won't be for military. Honest. It'll be so that we can fill in the hole in the common agricultural policy that we have created by increasing military spending in the multi-financial framework from 2021 to 2027 by 22 times what it currently is. So one thing I have discovered that I do like about the European Union, shoot me now for saying that, is that there is actually one successful policy. Not perfect down through the years, but I have been convinced that it is a good policy to follow. And that is the common agricultural policy. People say there hasn't been a war in Europe since the foundation of the European Union. Well, sorry, there has been, and you don't need to be a genius to prove them wrong on that. But, in fairness, mainly we've had our bellies full with decent food. And we do, in many cases, it can improve if it's done better, and I'm trying to improve what the Common Agricultural Policy is and make it better and more targeted towards the right things. But the point is, at the moment, to fund an increase in militarisation, they are taking money away from feeding and they're putting it into fighting. Have the European Union made a balls of the Common Agricultural Policy? Yes. Can it be improved? And if it's done right, can it work? Yes, it can. And I have bucket loads of amendments to Phil Hogan's original proposal. And that's the route that I hope they go. And there is a lot of support for it. But at the moment, remember this. In Ireland, and I had the IFA in with me in the last couple of weeks. Don't normally meet them. I don't feel like I need to, or I have to, because I don't think they represent the people they claim to represent. But I'll give you this insight. They are one of the lobby groups who are pushing for an increase in our GNI to 1.3%. And while I have said to them, look, if I could guarantee that money would go to agriculture, to better agriculture, agriculture that took account of the fact that the planet is burning up and actually did something about it, I would support more money going to that. But the big problem is, if I support an increase to 1.3% of GNI, a bit like if I buy a bowl of soup among all of ye in a restaurant and ye all throw in your ingredients, I don't know, I don't get to choose what is in that soup, but still I will have to pay for it. And my thinking is this, we go to 1.3% of GNI and there won't be a single penny extra for agriculture. Sorry, there will be a token few euro extra for agriculture, a token few euro extra for sustainable food. But what will happen is we will then have more money for militarisation. And that's what's going on at the moment. We are looking at putting more money into this. And there's also spin going on when it comes to this multi-financial framework. Yes, the UK are leaving. Yes, there is a bit of a hole because of it. But we are constantly told at committee meetings that the reason why we have to cut money to food is because the UK pulled out. Well, sorry. The new proposals that they have on the table at the moment, even at 1.1%, with a few extra resources coming from member states, actually means that the sum of money is just as much as what we're dealing with now. And I'll say it again, the difference is we're now moving towards pushing it into the military. And I can't support that, and I won't be supporting that. And we need to put pressure on the Irish government not to support that. Their argument will be, and the only thing you will hear is, we have to respect our farming community and we need more money for the Common Agricultural Policy, and this is why we're doing it. The sad thing about it is there's no guarantee that that money will go to agriculture. I was told by the IFA that they support it because the money won't, if it's not spent in Europe, it doesn't mean they'll spend it on agriculture here. Well, sorry, that is not a reason to go along with that. It's not a reason to gamble with our futures, and that is exactly what is happening. From the point of view of where you can get information on this, I'm very, very lucky. I have a lady working for me, lady here called Emma, and also Karen Devine has been helping me over the last 6 months. And what we're doing is, up until the last year, I haven't had the ability to attend all of these meetings, but what Emma does is, when the security and defence meetings are on, or when the constitutional affairs meetings are on, she attends absolutely every one of them. I attend the ones that I can attend, and they're very revealing. And into the future, that's what I plan to do, because I'll just give you an idea of one meeting. People mention military mobility, and it's one of these phrases, you know, you hear it so often that it doesn't mean anything anymore. But when you sit at one of these meetings, you get a real idea what it's about, because you're there listening on about how we're investing in the roads, etc., and we're putting special stuff into the roads under military mobility, so that, as Karen mentioned, so that we can get military equipment right across Europe. And it's like when you're sitting in the room there, and I ask the question, is there a war already on? What the hell are ye at? You get hums from the back of the room, and people are like going, why are you asking these questions? Well, the reason why is because I actually don't think the people of Europe know that this is going on. We're currently putting money into strengthening our infrastructure, not so that the bridge won't fall and kill a whole lot of people in Italy, so that the next time they build that bridge, you can drive a tank over it, and they can come and save us from an enemy that's reducing its spending in comparison to Germany, who we shouldn't be worried about at all, apparently. So, what do we do from here on? What we do is we try and continue to alert people as to what's going on, because I am convinced if more people find out about this and more people talk about this, more people will balk at this. And we talk about people that we can get to bring along with us. We can bring along the farming community. Before this, did anyone ever think of, I'll talk to the local farming organisations about this, and I'll get them to tell their members. Now, there fortunately is more than one farming organisation in this country. I work with another one called the Irish Neutrality Hill Farmers Association. So passionate about it, there's tears in their eyes after they sit down when they talk to their members. They know the significance of this, and they are spreading it to their members. So it makes it less abstract. Of course, we don't want war. And when it comes to neutrality, people get a little bit scared about it, as I said earlier. But when you break it down to brass tacks, a guy who's trying to work, or a woman who's trying to work on a mountain in Donegal, or work on bad land in Leitrim, which happens to be the best land in the world because it sequesters more carbon than anywhere else in the world, when they hear that they're going to be hit by it, you now have another ally on your side. And you've got to bring all of those on board. And I think that's exactly how we actually win this. So, are we winning at the moment? I don't think we're winning. But if we keep doing things like this, and we do more of it, and we talk to people who normally might not talk about this, interrupt Coronation Street, God forbid, and talk to them about it, and tell them. Because when you explain it, and that's why the military expert on RTE was uncomfortable this evening with what I was saying. When you explain to them that, actually, we live in a country currently where people aren't walking around with machine guns because we're under danger from someone. Why the hell would we change it? And if you say that to people on the basis that, well, they already have what we're apparently aiming for already in Europe, and it isn't particularly any safer there, in fact less safer, people start sitting up and listening and going, you know what, it isn't as simple as Brian Hayes said. It isn't as simple as Charlie Flanagan said. Maybe there's another side to this. So keep the debate going. That's how we win this ultimately. Now, we've had a lot of interesting speakers in the second panel, 3 very, very interesting speakers who came at it from a slightly different angle from the TDs. So I'm going to put it to the floor now for questions. And it sounds insulting and patronising to say questions, but we don't have time for statements, so we'll go to questions. And this man here with science something in Strasbourg.
Discussion points. I have 2 questions on that. First of all, which is a better tactic for Ireland to try and stay as demilitarised as we can, given that Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil will probably remain in government? Is it better that they commit, at least nominally, to military neutrality and present themselves like that even though they're going down the other road? Or is it better that they come out openly in a kind of Peter Casey way and announce that we're not neutral and we're just going to go with it and that's it? Which is actually better for staying demilitarised? And the second question is just about getting the message out. We've had a lot of talk about it in general, but I mean, what I thought was interesting from what Dr. Devine said about Monet, and Africa. Leo Varadkar, in his address to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, his final point when asked what should Europe do to get people more interested, to get citizens more feeling more European, he said, we should do more in Africa. And that was his exact phrase. I'm wondering, no one in Ireland seems to be talking about it. It wasn't in any media. How can we get to people, how can we get people to be aware of what our own Taoiseach is saying when they don't care what Manfred Weber is saying, what Macron is saying, when they're presented with exactly what they've said about European defence? How do we change the mantra if only 12% are vaguely aware of it?
I'm going to briefly address that. One thing that could change is that European Parliament report wouldn't be put on when everyone is pissed when they come home from the pub or getting over a hangover on a Saturday morning. If the European Parliament is important enough to have elections to, if it's important enough to rob money out of your pocket to give me massive wages, surely it is important enough to put on once a week on prime time or once a week on the Matt Cooper and Thing Show, whatever they're calling it nowadays. That would help. But there's one thing that doesn't help. That is when the show put out that information. And by the way, it was worse. I boycotted European Parliament report because it was on after 12 o'clock at night at one stage. And as far as I was concerned, the only way to change that was that no MEP appear on it, and then they'd have to cancel the programme, either that or put it on at the right time. Now, that's obviously not the total solution. I'm not saying people would be sitting there going, wow, this is really interesting. But you know what? No more than when I said put cameras in our council chamber in Roscommon so that people would know the shite you're talking. I tell you, it'd make the ones in the chamber sit up and talk a little bit more in a sensible way. Likewise, if we were under a little bit more exposure from the media, I'd actually I'd try a bit harder too. Everyone would. And it would, I believe, change it significantly. I don't know. And on the Casey thing, if there were to be as blunt as him on it, well, you know what? That would be a good thing, because then we'd officially be able to say to all the people who believe everything Fine Gael say that, well, they've just said it. You believe them, surely, and you told me you don't agree with it. Stop bloody voting for them. So I'd be delighted if they were honest about it. So anyway, Karen.
Just in relation to your questions, just to echo what Luke said, there's no point in allowing the government to talk about military neutrality or even nominally committing to it, because actually what military neutrality means now is membership of a military alliance through a WEU merger and signing up to a mutual, automatically obligating mutual defence clause. So that's what military neutrality means. And in the 1996 white paper on foreign policy, the only one written in the history of this state, they said military neutrality means not being part of a military alliance. And remember I said that was that letter that Brian Cowan wrote on the 5th of December 2003. Well, what the Irish government were doing was actually changing the meaning of military neutrality according as to what was happening to the mutual defence clause. Because when it was in the protocol, they were saying, when it got removed from the protocol into the text of the treaty, they said, well, it just means non-membership of a pre-existing military alliance, so this is going to be a new one, that doesn't have a mutual obligation for defence. They just kept changing the definition of it, so do not let them talk about military neutrality. And one final thing, just in terms of this, in terms of what we need to do, I mean, 100,000 people came out onto the streets to protest the invasion of Iraq. We have to understand that there will be another invasion. It won't be by the Americans, it will be by this European Union army on some pretext, and we need to march now to stop that from happening in the first place, because the media are not going to do their job. I've been dealing with the media for 15 years on this, and they will not allow you to tell the truth about what is going on in this area.
Roger.
The actual interpretation, the actual what military neutrality means is we love war. That's what it actually means. In other words, exactly, it does not mean, it doesn't mean neutrality at all. It means that we support war by allowing 3 million US troops going through Shannon Airport and kill thousands and thousands, help the Americans kill thousands of people, and it means becoming, essentially, disappearing the Irish Army and making it part of a European army. And you can't convince people to die for Europe unless you introduce European citizenship, unless you keep on talking about Europe is fantastic and it's wonderful and we're all European. That's why it isn't just the military-industrial complex. The use of the EU flag waved by you two is loved by the arms industry. But they need it. They need you two to support war, to support the arms industry. They have to get young people on their side, not old folks right? I'm too old, that's fine. Well, not too hard here. So, I mean, that's what that means. So, we have to decide, all of you here, obviously here, you're kind of, I presume, reasonably interested in not dying, right? That you have to spread the word. You've got the documents, come to the conference, there's lots going on. You won't get it from the corporate media, but therefore you have to use the facilities that Luke and others are using, right?
Yep. Okay, thanks, Roger. Questions, and 1 minute to ask the question because we're running out of time rapidly. This man here, the glasses.
Okay,
thank you.
The question I have here is about the origins of the European Union. I just want to know how many people might have this information, which I think is reliable, a reliable source.
And you have a minute.
It's about Walter Halston. He was a Nazi law professor. And in 1957, he said he was described as the blood and honor, the German blood and honor lawyer. In 1957, this lawyer, he became the chief architect of the European Union's basic structure and the first head of the European Commission. The executive, this was the executive body of the European Union, designed from the beginning to rule Europe outside any democratic control. Now, this blood and honor lawyer, he became the first, said that. Now, I have a photograph here as well of this.
You have about 10 seconds, I'm sorry.
Sitting with Chancellor Flanagan, signing the first Treaty of Rome in 1957. And their purpose was to make a confederation out of the European Union free of democratic control. It's a Nazi project from day one.
All right, thank you for that. This man here.
I will ask a question, and I'll unfortunately.
You'll be in trouble if you don't.
In any case, by the way, I am with student media, so would you mind if I were to record your response to this?
Yeah, no problem. And if I had a problem with it, well, then I am a problem.
Yes! So there's a lot of conversation going on in the earlier segment and in this segment as well. And I feel there's a lot of dismissal of Russia. Some people were saying, well, their defense spending is lower, they've been cutting it down. I think the fact is their army is still far larger. And we've seen in the Caucasus, in Eastern Europe, that they are willing to use it without much problem. There are certain manifestos of a couple of nutjob politicians in Russia who seem to be predicting their sort of geopolitical strategy. In any case, my question is essentially, so if, okay, how many seconds do I have?
Go on, keep going.
Right. If the EU military is not a good idea, if you feel it is a move towards centralization in a negative way, tied to the military industrial complex and support, what is the answer to increase Russian aggression? What is the answer to the threats that we see? Because I see a lot of, well, this is bad, but then what is the alternative to which it is being proposed?
And Claudia, in your meter?
The answer is something we don't have to invent. It is already there. It's international law. And yes, Russia was breaking international law by joining Crimea to its own territory. But NATO states did a similar break of international law by recognizing Kosovo as a breakaway state of Serbia as an independent state, which was totally against international law, and by waging this war on aggression against Yugoslavia. So the problem is, if the strongest military power starts with breaking international law, it leaves this moral space for all the other countries of doing the same. So the answer is coming back internationally to respect international law, and not to being a criminal yourself and telling others you're a criminal, and then getting a bigger criminal to stop the others from being criminal. So for me, this makes no sense at all to apply this kind of tactics, but to come back to respecting human rights and international law. And this is very clear in the way it's dealt. And also, you do peace, you do negotiations for peace, not with your nice neighbor, but normally with very ugly guys. So the answer is diplomacy and international law.
Roger, next, and then everyone wants to
say it from their perspective, right? Russia was invaded by Poland, he was invaded by Hitler. The NATO expanded, broke the agreement with Gorbachev and expanded right up to their very borders, right? Sebastopol and the Crimea was part of Russia until what's his name? Khrushchev did a deal, right, just to get votes, to be power. The vast majority of people in Crimea are Russian, right? Now, it's wrong, I'm not agreeing that it was against international law, but it is not true, in my opinion, that Russia is this great, big, evil empire wanting to invade Western Europe. They're a tiny country. Their GDP is not that different to Holland. I mean, they're not a rich country.
It's smaller than Belgium and the Netherlands put together.
This idea that it's a big, terrible thing is utter and absolute and complete rubbish. There's no truth to it whatsoever. You just keep on saying it far enough. The reality is that if we want peace, what we have to do is negotiation with Russia, or indeed China, because what the other lot want to do is to go to war with them. And you have to, I don't believe the Russians lost 24 to 25 million people in the Second World War. Do you really think they want a war? Do you really think that a people that lost 24 million people want another war? I don't think it's credible.
Karen?
Yeah, just to, again, one of the things I always encourage my students to do is to be critical, independent thinking. And so I think that there is a sort of a movement within the sort of the pro-defence, European security and defence policy circles to try to sabre-rattle. So if you think about the Ukraine, the European Union was funding the election campaign of a guy who actually won the presidency, and one of the first things he did was pass a law to stop Russian being the language of secondary school education, in which half of eastern Ukraine, they spoke Russian. And so when you look, if you look critically at what actually goes on, you can see that the EU is actually trying to stir this up. But look at what the relationship is between Russia and the EU. It's about oil and gas. Okay? There is no way that Russia wants to go to war against Western Europe, against the European Union. And there's no way that, in fact, a lot of companies within the European Union want that either, because the flow of energy between Russia and Western Europe, it's too important for the economy. So I think you've got to be really critical and go looking for an alternative perspective on some of these things.
This man here, you want to make a quick point, and then I'm going for the last question to a man who has fun written on his t-shirt. So.
Quick point. It's like the McCarthyite demonisation of Russia as the same as what they did to Saddam, who was no gentleman either. They did it to Gaddafi as well. Yeah, they're doing it at the moment to Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Iran. Yeah, you have.
And they did it to Greece until they kicked them quiet.
We see the democratic mayhem in the Anglo-American axis at the moment. You have madness in Westminster, you have madness in Washington. Yeah? These are the boys that are generating it. It's neoliberal It's a neoliberal imperialism. And they went in after the fall of the wall with the carpetbaggers, the same as they went into the South after the American Civil War, the Yankee capitalists. Yeah? It's corporate mafias. And they got their nose out of joint when the Russian mafia said, you're on our turf, back off. If the mafia's getting it, the Russian mafia's getting it. And that's what's happening. What we're having are mafia wars between the Chicago boys, the neocons, and the Russian boys who are saying, hey, this is our bag of resources. They don't need Africa. It's Europe and America that want Africa, and China wants Africa. Russia has the biggest bag of resources on the planet.
Thank you.
Can I just say one last thing, just very quickly? It was the United States and George W. Bush that actually reneged on the SALT treaty. So that it's the Americans that are actually reneging on a lot of these arms control treaties that are there in the international law system.
But also some very
let this man in now, just ask this question.
Everyone in the where do I actually get information on this so that I don't sound stupid when I go out tomorrow and tell people that they're building a ring road around Galway to bring tanks around?
You'll get it on PESCO.ie. Check out the website we put up, PESCO.ie. You'll get an awful lot of it from Hannah.
Specific facts on history that actually, complement what's on that website, that can really hammer it home to people. Where can I
go to your library and go to Easton's and go to the history section.
And Google numerous speeches by Devine as well. I would suggest that, and you'll learn an awful lot about it. But I think the main thing to learn, is that PESCO is permanent, it's structured, and it is cooperation. And it is leading us down the road of purchasing weapons with people we shouldn't be purchasing weapons with, on the basis that we'll get them cheaper. Like, that is utter madness. And it also means we will be training with these people. And in a way, it's like going out for a night and spotting the biggest guy in the nightclub, and regardless of how pissed they are, heading into the chipper with them on the basis that you'll have peace and no one will hit you. You'll both end up in hospital. You'll have a great fight, but there won't be bloody peace.
Just to finish on that, where would you suggest the best place to bring this information to? What's the best way to actually spread it, to get the message across?
The best way to spread it is basically spread it on the internet, because my outlet is 82 years of age, and that's where he reads all his stuff at this stage, as do my 4-year-old, 13-year-old and 15-year-old daughters. So maybe the media might be ignoring it, but they can ignore it all they want, because maybe it was a mistake, maybe it was a good thing. But when they elected me to the European Parliament, they give me a massive advertising budget, and I hate giving money to the people I'm giving it to. Instagram, I don't like giving money to Facebook, I don't like giving money to Twitter. But the thing that makes me sleep at night is, I know there's a lot of people out there who hate the idea that I got elected, and the reality is they would love if I wasn't doing that and wasn't putting it out there. But one thing that could be done better is more coordination, as in every single time these people publish news, and every single time anyone in any of these movements publish news, we put it on, let's say, my Facebook page, Mick Wallace's Facebook page, Clare Daly's Facebook page, because when you add them all up, you end up with hundreds of thousands of people who you can reach. And if your information is convincing and it can't be contradicted and there is no lies in it, eventually you'll break through. I mean, I'm proof of that. I mean, I started off with 548 votes. Last election, I got 129,000 votes, and so many after it that I can't remember the hundreds anymore. So it is possible to build something, and it can actually be done. I wouldn't despair. I take an awful lot of hope out of the fact that new people are getting interested in this, and we can do something about it.